Hi, this is Krishna Iyer with the Iyer Think Tank in Delray Beach. I'm glad you could join us today. This podcast is about this book. It's Guardians of the Dynasty. It's a book by Richard Millett. The title of this book, it's a library book, but the title is not reflective of actually what it is. The title, it makes it an ambiguous title, maybe, like a propaganda book. The government calls it a propaganda book. But, Guardians of the Dynasty, a history of the U.S. created Guardia Nacional de Nicaragua and the Somoza family. If you're familiar with Nicaraguan history, you'll know about, Anastasia Somoza and the Somoza family. Anastasia Somoza Garcia, the first one, and then, going down to, Anastasio Somoza de Bale, who is the most recent ruler of Nicaragua that is no longer in power. So we're going to discuss first the U.S. white supremacists, rapists, and murderous butchers, and their campaigns in Latin America. Our view is that the United States has no right to be involved in Latin American politics. The white supremacists do not consider Latin American opinion. They are not respected by the Hispanic people as responsible rulers and are violent in their treatment of the natives and poor in their economic formulations and systems. This is shown by their Nicaraguan white supremacist rape and murder campaign against Sandino and the Sandinistas. Also regarding this is the starvation against the people who had no money, and there was rampant prostitution in the land. Who created that prostitution? It is unclear based on reading this book, but with our experiences with Saigon, with Bangkok, with all of the other U.S. military-run dictatorships, prostitution is always an American invention. It is something that the third world gets as a result of American imperialism. So even though there is no description, and it may have been something before the Nicaraguas, before America invaded Nicaragua, it is, something that we must link to the American government. Their presence there creates a prostitution, maybe because of the people's inability to feed themselves, maybe because of this people's desperation. Whatever it is, it has to be linked to the American government's presence in Latin America. So in addition, there was poor income for the locals who loved Sandino. A little bit about Sandino. Sandino is a half Indian, half Hispanic landowner's son. He was the son of a Hispanic landowner and a Indian woman. He was, interested in liberalizing, and he found to see that the American government, wanted a conservative oligarchy in Nicaragua to prevent the people from democracy. They wanted a oligarchy to control the people with guns. And that's what ended up happening. And no matter how you look at it, Sandino was simply expressing his desire to have a country where the Latin Americans, were able to spread their culture and community across the land without guns. And that's what ultimately ended up happening. The U.S. government went in there and created a gun violence situation, and mass murder, mass rape, mass torture, mass imprisonment, the name of the game for U.S. imperialism and U.S. colonies. So basically, the Latin Americans, Mexico was one of, Sandino's loved countries. He wanted, Latin America sovereignty. The U.S. is not respected in Latin America. They have no respect among the locals in Latin America. They can, imperialize. Anybody can take a gun and walk into the presidential palace with machine guns and say, come with us. We're now in charge of your oil fields. Anybody can do that. The American government has done that in Venezuela recently. That's their, campaign in Latin America. Their Hispanic, violent predators of Hispanic campaign by the U.S. white supremacists, in Latin America. So, he basically, no one respects them in Latin America. No indigenous population, no Hispanic population, other than the money makers that have, there are 2 or 3 of them that run the country, respect them. And that's how American capitalists' economies in Hispanic countries are run, by 2 or 3 oligarchs who, if you dissent against, you get murdered. That's ultimately how America runs its, campaign. They're white supremacists, rapists, and murderous butchers. That is what they did in Latin America. They're, rapists and murderous butchers, created a campaign of, oligarchy. And then, the other thing we want to talk about is the Somoza National Guard. They created the National Guard, which is an American fascist, white supremacist butchery campaign against the Hispanic people. They forced a guard that was run by a pro-American rapist and murderer, an English speaker. He was, very fluent in English. He became very interested. Stimson, Secretary of State Stimson, became very interested in Somoza because of his, knowledge of English. That is the way you run a Latin American country. A toilet repairman and a used car salesman, Anastasio Somoza Garcia, was, good in English. So, of course, he gets to overcome all of the Hispanic, democratic thought as to what is best for the country. It is a self-serving group of whites in Washington. They are rapists and murderous white butchers of the U.S. government. So now we're going to, give some background. The Major Carter's Constabulary was the first chapter we discussed yesterday. Please read it on your own, as it is good background for this book. In The Guardia Reborn, we discussed the American destabilization campaign against Nicaragua with the creation of the National Guard by Stimson and Roosevelt, which was an example of the meddling by the U.S. government in Nicaraguan politics. The rapists, pimps, and murderous butchers of America have no right to meddle in Latin America because they are violent white supremacists with murder and rape as their mode of ruling Hispanic land. They not only do not keep documentation of their murderous butchery in Latin America, nor do they acknowledge the rapes and murders by their troops or their paid assassins in power. The Nicaraguan Guard was created by the United States solely for the purpose of controlling the Nicaraguan people. It was meant to suppress dissent of the people and to ensure the death of Sandino. It failed on both points miserably, as America always fails miserably in Latin America and across the Third World. In Chasing Sandino, we discussed the rapists and murderous white butchers and white supremacists in their failed attempt to capture Sandino, the son of an Indian woman and Hispanic landowner in Nicaragua. Mexico was a good friend of Sandino, and the U.S. white mafia of supremacists did not accept Sandino as a popular figure in Hispanic politics. He was native and wanted Latin American countries to decide the Nicaraguan fate. He wanted an American withdrawal and acceptance by the United States that Latin America is sovereign and better suited for governance in Hispanic countries of Latin America. The rapist white supremacists of Washington could not accept this and preferred Somoza, the English-speaking murderous butcher and rapist, as leader of the land. They hence trained the National Guard, and Stimson became good friends with Somoza. Just a few points on Sandino. Sandino was a very popular leader. He was very liked by the people and was able to mobilize popular support and resistance to American imperialism and murderous white supremacist anti-Hispanic butchery. Sandino was half Indian and was born in 1898 by an Indian woman and a Hispanic landowner. He was very respected in Latin America, unlike the white supremacist rapists and murderous butchers of the American government. So let's get started. We have 3 chapters. We're going to go 3 chapters today, and then, hopefully we'll be able to finish the book, I think, in another 3 days. Politics and Personalities, Nicaraguan and American. A variety of political problems dogged the Guardia from its inception. In Nicaragua, these included conflicts over its constitutionality, efforts to destroy its nonpartisan character, conflicts between the 2 major parties in which the Guardia became involved, disputes over the budget, and the involvement of the Guardia in supervising elections. On the American side, there were conflicts between military and civilian officials, disputes within the military itself, and the pressure of opposition to American intervention from within the United States. On a wider scale, problems were created by the opposition throughout Latin America to American intervention in Nicaragua. Political problems within Nicaragua greatly affected the Guardia's development. Those involving the signing of the Guardia Agreement between the United States and Nicaragua and the unsuccessful efforts to ratify it during the Diaz administration have already been detailed. Not content with the blocking of the ratification of the agreement, the opposition in the Nicaraguan Congress, led by General Chamorro, also strove to keep Guardia funds out of the regular budget and to reduce the number of American officers attached to the force. Chamorro also managed to prevent the congressional passage of the American-designed electoral law, forcing President Diaz to issue it as a presidential decree. The State Department hoped that the results of the 1928 election would resolve many of the political obstacles to Guardia's development, but conducting the election produced its own set of problems. The head of the American Electoral Commission was an Army officer, Brigadier General Frank McCoy. General McCoy had considerable experience in Latin America, having directed Cuban financial affairs under the American military government from 1900 to 1902, and having served as military attaché in Mexico in 1917. He also had been chief of staff of the Woods-Forbes investigation mission in the Philippines and had served as director of the Army's Bureau of Insular Affairs, the unit that administered the customs receiverships in Haiti and the Dominican Republic. General McCoy also possessed important qualifications, including an ability to speak Spanish and a reputation for carrying out his assignments in a firm, consistent, and diplomatic manner. The State Department was quite satisfied with McCoy's appointment. Had a civilian been appointed, the department would have had to pay his salary out of its very small emergency fund, or would have had to ask for an appropriation, a course which the controversy over the American presence in Nicaragua made highly undesirable. In addition, the department felt that of the Electoral Commission, someone with military experience who could control the Marines. In addition, the department felt the military situation made it necessary to appoint as chairman of the Electoral Commission someone with the military experience who could control the Marines. Under such conditions, General McCoy, who had the firm support of Stimson, seemed to be the logical choice. The State Department, however, overlooked the problems of inter-service rivalry, which were created by placing an Army officer in a position where he would exercise some control over Marine operations. The Guardia Nacional occupied an important position in the American plans for supervising the election. In October 1927, the American charge had noted that unless the Guardia was expanded sufficiently to exercise control over all the important departments in Nicaragua, it would be impossible to hold the satisfactory election next year. On March 21st, 1928, the State Department asked President Diaz to turn over control of the Guardia to General McCoy. At the same time, the Secretary of State expressed the hope that McCoy would conduct Guardia operations through the appropriate Marine officers. President Diaz, as usual, complied with the State Department's wish. His decree establishing the election law included an article giving General McCoy authority to command the services of the National Constabulary National Guard, to give the force such orders as he may deem necessary and appropriate to ensure a free and impartial election. The Navy was upset by this action and by what they felt was McCoy's tendency to interfere in military matters, especially his effort to investigate the overall military situation for the State Department. Within a few weeks, Admiral Sellers, commander of the Special Service Squadron and ranking naval officer in the area, was complaining that the general was in everybody's mess, but nobody's wash. While voicing complaints privately, the admiral worked openly to minimize possible conflicts of authority. He sent McCoy a copy of Secretary of Navy's letter of December 9, 1927, governing relations among military units in Nicaragua, and pointed out that some features of this order were in direct conflict with President Diaz's decree. Sellers added that he would ask the Secretary of the Navy to modify his offers to eliminate this conflict and pledged that he and those under his command would render all possible assistance to a personal representative of the President of the United States in carrying out the important work in Nicaragua upon which he is now engaged. The amiable tone of this communication proved somewhat ephemeral. On April 18th, during a meeting at the American legation, General McCoy criticized the Marines' campaign against Sandino, declaring, "Unless you get Sandino by a month from now, you will have failed, and I will so report to the State Department." Admiral Sellers complained to the Navy Department that the general's statements would seem to indicate that he is under the impression that he too has certain responsibilities relative to the conduct of operations over and above the obligation simply to make the recommendation to the President and the Secretary of State. Sellers was further upset because General McCoy, bypassing the normal chain of command, was issuing orders directly to the Guardia's commander, Lieutenant Colonel Brigadier General of the Guardia, Elias Beadle. The admiral felt that McCoy should go through regular channels and only make recommendations, not issue direct orders. Early in May, a direct conference between Sellers and McCoy temporarily resolved their disputes, with the general disclaiming any allusions as to his responsibility for the conduct of military operations in Nicaragua. The conflict revived in July when, without consulting either Sellers or General Phelan, the Marine Brigade Commander, General McCoy, ordered Beadle to distribute Guardia personnel only at department capitals. Sellers complained that such actions resulted in the Guardia, whose mission he saw as almost identical with that of the Marine Brigade, being completely divorced officially from the military operations of this brigade. The organization immediately responsible to our government for military activities in Nicaragua. The Navy Department may well have sympathized with Sellers' complaints, but McCoy had the confidence of the State Department, and nothing was done to change the situation. General McCoy's dispute involved the Guardia's commander, General Beadle, who opposed the Board of Elections' plan to have members of the Guardia seated directly at the tables where Nicaraguans cast their ballots. Beadle feared this plan would leave the Guardia open to charges of partisanship and argued that their duties should be confined to efforts to maintain order. McCoy, however, opposed having Marines exert such civil police functions and expressed his desire that at least 2 members of the Guardia help supervise each polling place. This proposal was endorsed by General Phelan, who argued that the Guardia's closer contacts with Nicaraguan citizens would make them more efficient in dealing with complaints. While unwilling to use the Marines to investigate electoral complaints, the brigade's commander evidently had no such compunctions when it came to arresting opponents of the intervention. Toribio Tijerino, the leader of the small pro-Sandino Nationalist Party, had incurred the wrath of the Marines, and despite McCoy's protests, Phelan had him arrested shortly before the election. Pressure from both Eberhard and McCoy, however, soon forced his release. Despite such incidents, American supervision of both registration and voting in 1928 proved remarkably successful. To curb the traditional Nicaraguan practice of voting at as many precincts as one could reach in a day, each voter's fingers was dipped into mercurochrome dye. The Sandinistas denounced the election and circulated a rumor that the dye was poison. But despite such efforts, 133,000 Nicaraguans, nearly 90% of those eligible, voted, giving General Moncada and the Liberals a decisive 19,000 vote victory. Even the opposition conservatives, the first party in power in Nicaragua's history to lose an election, acknowledged that the results were valid. The Marines were greatly relieved to see McCoy's mission conclude and the Army General return to the United States. His presence in Nicaragua had generated fears that the State Department might be considering replacing the Marines attached to the Guardia with Army officers. In October 1928, an apparent effort to forestall any such action, Colonel McCarthy Little, director of the Marine Corps Operation and Training, drafted a lengthy memorandum justifying the Corps' involvement in developing armed forces throughout Latin America. The colonel wrote, "Questions dealing with Central America have been handled for many years by the State Department, whose representatives have been sustained when necessary by our naval forces, the nature of whose duties serves to keep them in close touch with the varying situations which exist there. In other words, the support of our diplomatic agents has become and is recognized at home and abroad as a function of the Navy. This is especially true of our relations with Central America. The assignment of functions of to the Navy has been endorsed by decisions of the Joint Army and Navy Board and is more or less recognized by foreign powers. To take from the Navy a problem it has successfully handled for a century and to assign such duty to the Army, of whose function is not properly a part, would be uneconomic to say the least. An Army officer assigned in charge of the problems of Nicaragua would, under the present system, depend mainly on naval sustenance, or rather upon the support of a service with whose technical limitations he is not wholly familiar. Why introduce this possibility jarring note? There certainly appears to be a naval service officer of proven ability who would fill the bill and at all times understanding in the relations to our naval forces. To assign Army officers to the Guardia Nacional is to introduce an additional system of training, unless the work of those officers who have so far been charged with its development show an amount of deficiency which warrants a change. An additional system would but cause obstruction. Army officers detailed for duty under Marines would require instructions in our special type of training. Army training placed over a Marine system would, to a large degree, undo the results of last year's work. Marines have so far proved their ability. Why then not allow them to carry on? Admiral Sellers supported the Marine stand, observing that, from my experience for the past year of the Army officers in Nicaragua, I'm very decidedly of the opinion that the best results will not be obtained by mixing the Army and the Navy and Marine Corps in matters like the present operation. To import a lot of Army officers, those whose standards, traditions, and methods differ from ours, does not tend to promote harmony, efficiency, or develop esprit de corps. The adamant stand of the Navy and Marines upon this point prevailed. No Army officers were attached to the Guardia, and in both 1930 and 1932, a naval officer served as chairman of the Electoral Commission, thereby preventing any additional inter-service rivalries during the intervention. While General McCoy's departure following the 1928 elections resolved one set of problems facing the Marines and the Guardia, the inauguration of the victorious General Moncada as president created numerous new difficulties. Ambitious and somewhat Machiavellian, Moncada, unlike his predecessor Adolfo Diaz, was determined not to be an American puppet. Realizing that he would have little success in confrontation with a unified American opposition in Nicaragua, the new president sought ways to divide the military and diplomatic representatives of the United States. He began by cultivating the brigade's commander, General Phelan. Even before his inauguration, Moncada had written Admiral Sellers to suggest that Phelan be given the authority to coordinate the work of such officials as I may be able to secure from our governments, adding that he believed the general better equipped to undertake this work than any other person. The general better equipped. Phelan was attracted to the proposal, which would have made him virtually an American High Commissioner in Nicaragua. He wrote the Marine Corps commandant, urging him to seek State Department approval, adding that his appointment would be the best consideration of our position, that the Navy Department, with the Marine Corps as its active agent, is the most concerned with the carving out of American policies in Latin America, particularly in Central America. Despite endorsements by both Phelan and Sellers, the American minister had no sympathy for Moncada's proposal, highly suspicious of possible military encroachments on State Department prerogatives. Eberhard had already clashed with Sellers and Phelan over a Nicaraguan proposal to give them rank of ministers, plenipotentiary, and envoys extraordinary to the United States. The minister was generally supported in his opposition to Moncada's proposals by Lieutenant Colonel Elias Beadle, the Guardian's Jeffy director, who had earlier offended the Nicaraguan president by refusing to charge without evidence soldiers whom Moncada had accused of being criminals. Beadle and Eberhard had also successfully opposed Moncada's effort to enlist political supporters as voluntarios and use them in a campaign against Sandino. By late January 1929, Eberhard had become convinced that General Phelan and President Moncada were conspiring to convert the Guardia into a partisan force. with the Marine general virtually functioning as Moncada's Minister of War. A Nicaraguan proposal to place Guardia operations directly under Phelan's control was taken as further evidence of such a conspiracy, and with Colonel Beadle's support, Eberhard urged State Department action to block this effort. The pressure ultimately proved successful as the Chief of Naval Operations, after consultation with the State Department, announced that it would be unwise and illegal to place the Guardia under the commander of the Marine Brigade, since that would make that officer subject to the orders of the Nicaraguan president. After some hesitation, Eberhard informed the State Department that the continued disputes among American leaders in Nicaragua made it necessary to replace both Beadle and Phelan. While defending Beadle's actions, the American ministry recognized that it would be extremely awkward to remove Phelan alone. In addition, the Nicaraguan president had expressed the lack of confidence in the Jeffy director, a situation Eberhard blamed on Phelan's influence. The day Eberhard sent his message calling for these replacements, the Navy Department announced that Beadle would be replaced as Guardia commander by Colonel Douglas McDougall, a former commander of the American-led Garda de Haiti. When, however, Phelan's transfer was delayed, Eberhard complained bitterly to the State Department, charging that the general's actions had seriously damaged the prestige of the legation, the Guardia, and the Marine Corps, adding that this retention would jeopardize our whole Nicaraguan program. Admiral Sellers opposed Phelan's removal, leading the American minister to accuse both officers of obstructing United States policy and encouraging Moncada's efforts to convert the Guardia into a partisan political force. Both officers heatedly denied the accusations, which Phelan declared were based upon a single piece of underhand gossip which the minister had heard in a Nicaraguan nightclub. Sellers added that Eberhard was aware that the charges were false, but persisted in furnishing the Department of State with the gross misinformation which places the squadron commander in a false position, with the Special Service squadron commander and the American minister not speaking to each other. It now became necessary to replace them, as well as Beadle and Phelan, and later by 1929, all four had been removed from the Nicaraguan scene. The entire dispute served to emphasize the primacy of the State Department in determining Nicaraguan policy. Acting under State Department instructions, the Navy Department informed Sellers, Phelan, and Beadle's successors that the American minister in Nicaragua, and in his absence, the charged affairs, is the only personal representative of the President of the United States in Nicaragua, and that the officers of the American Armed Forces in Nicaragua should not advise the President of Nicaragua or other Nicaraguan officials independently. Whenever the officers of the American Armed Forces desire to discuss matters with the President or a minister of the Cabinet, the Navy Department will arrange that they should request the American minister or charged affairs to request the interview and take it to them to it, and that matters in which they may disagree with the chief of mission shall not be taken up with the government of Nicaragua without first being submitted to the government of the United States for its decision. Under these guidelines, President Moncada could no longer seek American military support for his disputes with the legation. At the same time, Marine criticism of State Department policy became more muted, since officers who continue to oppose established policies could expect no support from their superiors in Washington. Most Marines simply followed State Department policy, even when it seemed to them to be erroneous. They also avoided close contacts with President Moncada, feeling that they had little to gain and much to lose from such relationships. Moncada, in turn, became more difficult to get along with, even forcing one prominent Marine officer, Colonel Clayton Vogel, to be removed as the Guardia's chief of staff because of his refusal to purge conservatives from the force. The Guardia Jeffy director complained that Moncada is a difficult man to do business with. He is a hard drinker and is despotic and erratic to a degree when he is in his cups. He dislikes Americans. Under these circumstances, the Marines found it desirable to carry on, whenever possible, all contacts with the president through a Nicaraguan intermediary. The vital position came to be filled by personable young Nicaraguan with a fluent command of English, Anastasio Somoza Garcia. Increasingly, American officers tended to take their problems with the Nicaraguan government first to Somoza. In return, he transmitted and even explained and gave suggestions as to possible responses for Moncada's messages, to the officers. The Marines felt the words of the Guardia's last American chief of staff that Somoza always played the game fairly with us, and they came to develop considerable respect for him. The attitude would prove of inestimable value to General Somoza when it came time to select a Nicaraguan Jeffy director for the National Guard. President Moncada's maneuvers to gain control of the Guardia were not confined to efforts to influence American officers. Munro Cuadro Passo's agreement had still not been ratified. The Munro Cuadro Passos agreement had still not been ratified when he took office. So President Moncada tried to have an agreement amended in such a way as to make the force more subject to his control. He claimed that his proposal simply clarified the text's meaning, but Minister Eberhardt was convinced that his proposals would change the agreement as so radically as virtually to destroy the purpose for which it was intended. Eberhardt felt that most Nicaraguans wanted nonpartisan Guardia, but that leaders of both parties were opposed to such force and would defeat it if they could place the blame for this action upon their opponents. The cure for this situation, the minister argued, was to have the State Department authorize him, accompanied by the brigade and special service squadron commanders, to issue a demand that Moncada push the agreement through Congress without any amendment. In order to justify his efforts to gain control over the Guardia, Moncada began to accuse that force of inefficiency and of squandering its budgets on lavish receptions. Eberhardt dismissed this accusation as absurd, noted that during the past year, the Guardia has held only 5 receptions, every one of which was organized at the specific order of the Nicaraguan president. At this point, Moncada openly stated that he did not believe a nonpartisan military was possible in Nicaragua, and despite State Department objections, proceeded to support major amendments to the Guardia Agreement, which Congress obediently added before finally ratifying it on February 19th, 1929. The State Department had major responsibility to virtually every amendment made by the Nicaraguan government. One seemed to limit the Guardia's strength to that originally authorized in the Munro Cuadro Passos Agreement, the force entirely too small to deal with Sandino's rebellion. Other changes apparently empowered local Nicaraguan officials to issue orders to the Guardia, made officers subject to local courts for actions taken in their line of duty, and required all American officers attached to the force to have working knowledge of Spanish, a regulation that would have drastically reduced the number of Marines available for such duty. Moncada had begun to take advantage of the apparent subordination of the Guardia to local political officials, notably the jefe politicos in each department, who were presidential appointees, even before the amended agreement cleared Congress. On February 12, 1929, his private secretary informed General Beadle that the jefe of the Guardia in every department must obey the jefe politica in all attributions conferred upon them by law, adding that the president has the intention of exercising control over the Guardia through his secretaries of state and his jefes politicos. In May, in an effort to resolve these disputes, the State Department drafted a note for the Nicaraguan government to present to the United States, agreeing to interpret the amendments in a manner that would meet American objections. Under Diaz, it had been possible for the State Department to draft statements which the Nicaraguan president would later issue as an official statement of his government's policy, but Moncada would have nothing to do with such tactics. A similar effort by the State Department in 1930 proved equally successful. By the end of the year, efforts to secure a Guardia agreement satisfactory to all concerned were overshadowed by disputes over budget allocations, but as late as November 1931, State Department officials were still drafting long memoranda examining the constitutionality of the Monroe-Passos Agreement and the implications of the Nicaraguan amendments to it. Throughout this period, Moncada continued his efforts to use the force to advance his own political interests. In April 1929, he ordered the Guardian to imprison 16 of his political opponents, including the editor of La Nueva Prensa. This upset the State Department, which urged the Guardian not to make the arrest until the reasons for such actions were known. The Guardian's position was doubly complicated because, having assumed the nation's police duties, it could hardly avoid arresting Nicaraguan citizens upon orders issued by the nation's courts. With the courts under presidential control, Guardia involvement in political arrests became virtually inevitable. Seeking to avoid the involvement of the Guardia in political arrests, Secretary of State Stimson wrote Moncada that Nicaragua's futures depended greatly upon the establishment of an absolutely non-partisan, non-political Guardia, which will devote its entire attention to the preservation of peace, law, and order. The appeal made little, if any, impression on the Nicaraguan president, who continued ordering political arrests, justifying his actions with patently absurd allegations that the conservatives were plotting with Sandino to murder him and overthrow the government. He had the Guardia arrest more than 40 of his enemies and eventually deport 8 of them, including Adolfo Ortega Diaz, editor of La Prensa, Managua's leading conservative newspaper. Opposition attacks on these actions were directed against the Guardia as well as the Moncada administration, alleging that the force had no respect for civil officials, but only for military officers. The State Department also protested the actions, again without visible results. Moncada continued his efforts to place the Guardia under closer political control. Local Liberal Party leaders were now used to pressure the Guardia in transfer or discharge conservative officers and men stationed in their areas. The effort apparently met with little success. In December 1930, President Moncada, again claiming that his life was threatened, arrested additional opposition leaders. This time, State Department protests were somewhat muted, perhaps because several of those arrested were accused of involvement in a communist plot, making them considerably less likely subject of the department's sympathies than were the conservative leaders jailed along with them. Despite constant State Department rebuffs, Moncada also continued efforts to make the Guardia subject to control by Jeffy politicos locally. In October 1931, he again brought up the subject, writing Secretary of State Stimson to demand that the Guardia be altered to conform to the laws of this country. In reply, Stimson simply pointed out that under Nicaraguan law, such proposals would have to pass 2 sessions of Congress, and since the United States would have withdrawn by that time, such measures were now outside of American concern. The continuing conflicts with the Moncada administration produced a growing pessimism in the State Department concerning the Guardia's future. A memorandum by William Bullock, then in charge of the department's Central American desk, clearly expressed these findings. Bullock wrote, "Further direct interference by the president in the internal administration of the Guardia may be expected. I believe that a continuance of the policy of direct interference, particularly from now on when political passions may be expected to exercise a great influence on the affairs of Nicaragua, and when the Guardia Nacional, if it is to be effective, must be more than ever impartial and independent of such political passion, will tend to render the Guardia impotent and will convert it into a tool of partisan politics." Perhaps the most important of all the conflicts between the State Department and President Moncada involving the Guardia and Nacional was that concern with the budget appropriation. In the summer of 1929, Moncada demanded a complete study of Guardia costs and announced that plans to reduce its enlisted strength. This drew sharp protest from the Guardia's American commander and from the American legation, but produced a surprisingly mild response from the Secretary Stimson, who reminded the legation that in making up the budget, the limited resources available to Nicaragua must be kept in mind, and the size of the Guardia based upon that nation's minimum needs. The budget controversy intensified the following year when Nicaragua began to suffer the effects of the World Depression. In February, Moncada announced that he wanted Guardia expenses cut to no more than $800,000 annually. Colonel McDougall, Guardia's Jeffy director, wanted an increase in his budget, but receiving no State Department support for this proposal, announced that he was prepared to operate, if necessary, on an appropriation of $900,000, although this would require reducing enlisted personnel to 1,800. That in turn would necessitate abandoning many posts in the North. McDougall claimed that a budget of $800,000 would support only 1,500 men, a force too small to carry out the Guardia's assigned missions. In an effort to resolve this dispute, Matthew Hanna, who was in Washington preparatory to be appointed minister to Nicaragua, suggested that the proposed budget cuts be approved, providing the Guardia duties be confined to seriously disturbed areas and that forces of municipal police paid by the communities they serve handle routine police duties. This plan would have reduced the involvement of American officers in the arrest of Nicaraguan civilians, but it was turned down by the State Department, which continued to insist that the Guardia remain the only military and police force in Nicaragua. With no plan of its own to offer, the department attempted to temporize, expressing the desire to be guided by the wishes of the Nicaraguan government, but adding that it would be not disposed to concur in the reduction of the existing force to the point where its efficiency and ability to maintain order was seriously impaired. The financial crisis eased somewhat during the spring of 1930, but by the summer it was again a problem. In addition to pressing for overall reduction in the Guardia budget, Moncada now called for cuts of up to 20% in the salaries paid to American officers. This proposal upset the Marines more than anything since the Beetle-Phelan feud. Marine Corps headquarters argued that the proposed pay cut was only one cog in the policy to destroy the Guardia. Without asking the U.S. to withdraw the Marines attached to the Guardia, he kills it by non-support and thus lays the blame for the death of the United States and attains his end, that of substituting Nicaraguans of his own personal choice for the United States Marines. Colonel McDougall also attacked the proposals, claiming that the United States would either have to greatly reinforce the Marines in Nicaragua in order to make up for cuts in the Guardia, or else should withdraw all Marines as rapidly as possible to avoid becoming involved in the inevitable disorders following the reduction of the Guardia. Unwilling to accept either of McDougall's proposals, Secretary Stimson held an urgent meeting with Secretary of the Navy Adams, Admiral Pratt, and Marine Generals Fuller and Williams to discuss the problem, but they were unable to formulate any solution. A discussion with President Hoover the following day proved of even less help, as the president, bedeviled by the economic crisis, considered the Nicaraguan situation just one more trouble. The problem was referred back to the American legation, where the commanders of the Special Service Squadron, the Marine Brigade, and the Guardia met with the American minister to discuss the situation. The meeting was held November 1st, only 2 weeks before an order of Moncada's reducing the Guardia to 1,500 men was to take effect. The participants agreed that such a reduction would make it impossible to maintain order, but that if local police, trained by and enlisted in the Guardia, but paid by the towns they served, were created and the Guardia maintained its present strength of 2,000 men until those police could replace 500 of them, the proposed reductions would ultimately be acceptable. On the results of this and other conferences, a letter from Stimson to Moncada was drawn up in which the Secretary of State grudgingly agreed to reducing Guardia strength to under 2,000 enlisted men after the creation of an auxiliary force of local police. Stimson warned of the danger of mutiny if the force was not paid on time, adding that the United States would not expose its officers to such a threat. He demanded that Nicaraguan president gave the American Collector General of Customs explicit and irrevocable instructions to pay the Guardia's commander on the first of each month enough to maintain a force of 2,000 men until such time as the two governments arrived at a mutual agreement to reduce the force. Stimson made such provision a sine qua non for continued American support, bluntly stating that his government would hesitate to continue to cooperate with the Guardia unless its expenses are met. Moncada accepted the idea of replacing some Guardia with municipal police, but again asked the American officers' salaries be cut 20% and declared that the requirements of foreign bondholders prevented his obtaining the needed funds from the Collector General. In response, Stimson did make several concessions. These included reducing the pay of Americans to be detailed to the Guardia, although this was not to apply to those already on duty, cutting the ration allowance from 25 cents to 20 cents a day, and ultimately reducing the Guardia to a strength of 100 officers and 50 men at an annual cost of $799,652. These concessions seemingly pleased Moncada, who passed them on to McDougall, taking special care to emphasize that reductions should take place as conditions permitted. Conditions never did permit these cuts. In 1931, an increase in Sandino's activities meant that a larger, not a smaller force was needed. The formation of a Guardia Municipal, as the urban police were known, continued, but this produced no corresponding cuts in regular Guardia strength. Early in 1931, Nicaragua's financial situation was eased by $1 million loan from the International Acceptance Bank. Only $75,000 of this could be spent each month, $50,000 of which was to be spent in the Segovias, which meant in the fight against Sandino. In February, the National Bank of Nicaragua agreed to loan the government an equal amount, permitting expansion of the Guardia to a strength of 2,150 men. Slow expansion continued for most of the rest of the intervention, with the force reaching 303 officers, 2,274 enlisted men, and 33 prisoners on September 30th, 1932. Thanks in part to Sandino, the Guardia emerged from that budget crisis stronger than ever. American intervention in Nicaragua encountered political difficulties not only in that nation, but at home and throughout the Western Hemisphere as well. While few of these problems directly involved the Guardia, they did affect American policy and helped shape the Guardia's development. Within the United States, a longtime leader and opposition to American intervention was Senator William Borah of Idaho. As early as 1922, Senator Borah had charged that the people of Nicaragua are being exploited in shameless fashion by American corporations protected by the United States Marines. Following the 1926 intervention, Borah, along with Senators Shipstead and Wheeler, introduced resolutions condemning the action. In 1928, a rash of books and articles attacking the intervention and demanding immediate withdrawal from Nicaragua began to appear, with contents that ranged from intelligence criticism to wild accounts of alleged atrocities. But communists supported all American Anti-Imperialist League held rallies to denounce the Marines and gather funds for medicines for Sandino's troops. In Congress, Americans in Nicaragua were denounced as ambassadors of death, and Senator Wheeler sarcastically suggested that if Marines were going to fight bandits, they should be sent to Chicago instead of Nicaragua. As it became obvious that campaigns against Sandino would take years, not weeks, opposition in the United States increased. In 1928, the Senate held detailed hearings on American naval forces in Nicaragua, hearings that gave opponents of the intervention a major forum for denouncing American policy. In 1920, congressional opponents made a determined but unsuccessful effort to attach a rider to the Naval Appropriations Bill, cutting off all funds for the Marines in Nicaragua. The growing opposition in Congress strengthened Stimson's determination to end the intervention after Nicaragua's 1932 elections. To demonstrate this determination on this point, the Secretary in February 1931 had announced that the Marines would withdraw from combat duty in Nicaragua by June 1st, and that the Marine Brigade would be reduced to a training battalion of approximately 500 men stationed in Managua, plus a small aviation force. The Marines did not fully approve of this policy. The Marine Corps Commandant Major General B.H. Fuller testified before a House committee that it would not do to take the Marines away or the brigade away from Nicaragua, leaving American officers in charge of those Indians. because they would be very likely to mutiny and chase our officers out. They will not do that so long as there are 1,000 Marines close by in the country as a reserve and a backing for the officers of the National Guard. Fuller's objections were apparently ignored by both Congress and the State Department, and the resolution of the Marine Force took place as planned. Such efforts muted criticisms for a time, but in 1932, Stimson could no longer restrain the American intervention forces in Congress. When the Navy refused to incur a deficiency expense for the cost of supervising the 1932 election, Secretary Stimson held long conferences with members of both the House and Senate in an effort to obtain a congressional appropriation of the needed funds. These efforts, however, proved unavailing as the Senate refused to appropriate any funds for the election and even passed a rider to the appropriations bill forbidding the Navy to use funds for that purpose, thereby placing the Senate clearly on record as favoring a prompt end to the intervention. Despite this setback, President Hoover instructed Stimson to get the needed funds from other sources and not to interpret the Senate's action as a prohibition against supervising the elections. Some Americans, of course, favored the intervention, but only those individuals or companies directly involved in Nicaragua were active in making their opinions public. Their continued plea for expanded American interference in Nicaragua's internal affairs probably did Stimson's cause more harm than good, leading him ultimately to issue a statement that Marines would no longer be sent inland to protect American property in Nicaragua. The opinion of most Americans on Nicaragua was probably best summed up by Will Rogers, who asked, why are we in Nicaragua, and what the hell are we doing there? By 1932, Stimson may well have been asking himself the same question. Criticism of American actions in Nicaragua was widespread throughout Latin America. Sandino's efforts received enthusiastic support of such notable figures as the Mexican editor Jose Vasconcelos, the Chilean poet Gabriela Mistral, and the Peruvian politician Victor Raúl Haya de la Torre. Numerous accounts appeared in Spanish glorifying Sandino and condemning Americans as savages and oppressors of a few people. Sandino's fame reached even China, where one of Kuominting's divisions was named after him. Of much greater concern to the United States was the effect of the intervention on relations with other hemispheric nations. Despite American efforts to keep it off the agenda, the intervention emerged as a major issue during the 6th International Conference of American States, held in Havana from January 16th to February 20th, 1928. Both El Salvador and Argentina urged the conference to adopt a statement condemning intervention, with the Argentinian delegation declaring that intervention constituted an attempt against the independence of nations, which no plea of protection for the intervening powers citizens could justify. Secretary of State Hughes defended American policy as designed to secure the peace and independence of Nicaragua and attempted to redefine United States actions as being not intervention, but interposition of a temporary character. Despite support from Mexico, Colombia, Honduras, and Argentina, the delegate from El Salvador ultimately withdrew his motion condemning intervention, but the issue was hardly resolved by this action. Latin American opponents of the intervention continued to oppose American policy throughout the Hoover administration. They hampered Guardia efforts to close the border with Honduras, kept Mexico from recognizing the Moncada regime, and also provided supplies to Sandino. Their continued attacks on the intervention proved increasingly embarrassing to Stimson, and his efforts to mobilize support against Japanese occupations in Manchuria, giving him one more reason wanting to withdraw the Marines from Nicaragua as rapidly as possible. The net effect of these conflicts with the Guardia Nacional is difficult to assess. Within Nicaragua, political problems certainly had adverse effects, diverting the Guardia's attention to political instead of military areas and hampering the recruitment and training of organization. Most significantly, Moncada's actions left a dangerous heritage of direct involvement in the supposedly nonpartisan Guardia in internal Nicaraguan politics. Problems encountered in the United States and in that nation's Latin American policy also limited the Guardia's effectiveness. They helped sustain Sandino and at the same time held a frustrating effect had a frustrating effect upon the morale of the Marines stationed in the Guardia with the Guardia. Probably their most important influence was the greatly increasing pressure for American withdrawal, thus forcing the Guardia into combat before it was fully ready to assume their duty. This cut short the period of American leadership of the force and ultimately contributed to the withdrawal of all Americans before the Marines had trained enough officers to fully replace them. It is perhaps ironic that opposition to American imperialism in Nicaragua failed to alter the State Department's determination to create a new, better equipped, and more powerful Nicaraguan armed force, but may well have made it even easier for Somoza later to convert this force into an instrument of his own political ambitions. So that's it. That's an excellent chapter. Guardians, politics and personality. So let's, let's make some comments. So we see the general theme of the chapter. Let's just get a general bird's eye view of this chapter. Basically, American intervention condemned universally in Latin America. They don't respect the United States. The Latin American people, the Hispanic people, do not accept the United States. They do not respect the United States sovereignty in Latin America. They believe they are vicious thugs. I mean, they believe that they do not consider the people. They back Sandino all across the board. We read that. We understand that. It's just an action. They are violent predators of Hispanics. The U.S. government, white supremacists, are violent predators of Hispanics. They are white supremacist rapists and murderous butchers. That's what they are. So let's go through just a couple statements. And so basically the minister was generally appointed in his opposition to Moncada's proposal by Lieutenant Colonel Elias Beadle, the Guardia's Jeff director, who had earlier offended the Nicaraguan president by refusing to charge without evidence soldiers whom Moncada had accused of being criminals. So you can see the force of the National Guard was being used as a way of political imprisonment, like the standard thing for the United States government. We see it over and over in their military dictatorships. They pretend that it's, not really them, but it is them. It is their violent temperament and their, racism that creates this kind of problem. President Moncada, and hated, he was hated by Sandino. He was hated by the opposition. He wanted to imprison political prisoners. He wanted to imprison political prisoners in what we called a fair election, which it was fair according to the book and according to the electoral statistics. It was fair from that standpoint. But from the standpoint of the leader being, able to understand his limitations, it was not fair. And, the United States meddling in there made it unfair from the get-go. Their promotion of conservative landholders and all of that stuff, the oligarchy, created in one-sided situations for which Machado became victor. So continuing on, we had that. So you see that, it became a political tool for Moncada. Then we continued on with the Marines found it desirable to carry on, whenever possible, all contacts with the president through a Nicaraguan intermediary. The vital position came to be filled by a personal young Nicaraguan with fluent command of English, Anastasia Somoza Garcia. Increasingly, American officers tended to take their problem with the Nicaraguan government first to Somoza. In return, he transmitted and even explained and gave suggestions as to possible responses for Moncada's messages to the officers. The Marines felt, in the words of the Guardia's last American chief of staff, that Somoza also always played the game fairly with us, and they came to develop considerable respect for him. The attitude would prove of inestimable value for General Somoza when it came time to select Nicaraguan Jeffy director for the Guardia Nacional. So you can see already we're seeing the U.S. government trusted Somoza. They trusted Somoza. The American army trusted Somoza. The Marines trusted Somoza. They're, rapists. They're white rapists and murderous butchers. They're white U.S. government supremacists, rapists and murderous butchers. Their trust to Somoza is what led Nicaragua down the path of abyss. It led to an abyss of violence and an abyss of failure. It was just a political tool for the United States to use to imprison the opposition and to create a land of enslavement in Nicaragua. That's ultimately what it is. We know it. It's the same thing in all Latin American dictatorships. None of the Latin American countries respect the United States simply because they are enslavers. They are capitalist enslavers, exploiters of the Hispanic people. And there is no redemption for their actions. They are just interested in enslavement and exploitation. And if you don't follow their, actions, then they murder you and they rape you. That's how the U.S. government is. That's their white supremacists. So continuing on, we continued with so we got Garcia, then seeking to avoid the involvement in the Guardian political arrest. Secretary of State Simpson wrote Moncada that Nicaragua's future depended greatly on the establishment of an absolutely nonpartisan, non-political Guardia, which will devote its entire attention to the preservation of peace, law, and order. This appeal made little, if any, importance on the Nicaraguan president, who continued ordering political arrests, justifying his actions with patently absurd allegations that the conservatives were plotting with Sandino to murder him and overthrow his government. He had the Guardia arrest more than 40 of his enemies and eventually deport 8 of them, including Adolfo Ortogo Diaz, editor of La Prensa, Managua's leading conservative newspaper. So you can see, it became a tool of political violence. I mean, the U.S. created National Guard, became a tool of political violence. It became a machine gun government, imprison, murder, torture. That's what it became. It evolved. That slow evolution is being seen here. Right now, we're starting with imprisonments. Murder and torture will follow with Somoza's, result. But it became clearly a tool of political violence. And the U.S. government, did they do anything to stop it? No, they created this thing and they made the precedent for it. If the U.S. government created it, it is the responsibility of the U.S. government to ensure that this thing works for the country. It did not work for the country, and it became a tool of Somoza. It became a tool of the Nicaraguan oligarchy to murder the people and destroy the land of Nicaragua. So again, no respect in Latin America. Another example of no respect in Latin America because their hatred of Hispanic people and their hatred of the Hispanic and indigenous cultures there. They are only European Westerners. They're only interested in Western European culture and Western values. They are hateful of the Hispanic and indigenous people in Latin America. So continuing on the results of other conferences, a letter of Secretary of State Simpson to Moncada was drawn up in which Secretary of State grudgingly agreed to reducing the Guardia's strength to under 2,000 enlisted men after the creation of the auxiliary force of police. Simpson warned of the danger of mutiny if the force was not paid on time, adding that the United States would not expose its officers to such a threat. He demanded that the Nicaraguan president gave the American Collector General of Customs explicit and irrevocable instructions to pay the Guardia's commander on the first of each month enough to maintain a force of 2,000 men until such a time the two governments arrived at a mutual agreement to reduce the force. So, of course, the U.S. government always making sure that its troops are paid, but the people of Nicaragua don't get paid. I mean, that's what it is. The local Guardia doesn't get paid. The U.S. government troops have to get paid. Again, the white supremacists, rapists and murderous butchers, that's their approach. The American government, approach to, white supremacy and rape and murder of Hispanics in Latin America. So continuing on, so we went on to of much greater concern to the United States was the effect of the intervention on relations with other hemispheric nations. Despite American efforts to keep it off the agenda, the intervention appeared as a major issue as the 6th International Conference of American States held in Havana on January 16th and February 20th, 1928. All of basically the long and short of it is Latin America can't stand the United States. They can't stand their approach. Starting in 1920s, this is, the standard thing. The U.S. government does not belong in Latin America. That's my opinion. That is my opinion. That can be my opinion. Other people's opinion can be different. But my opinion is that Latin America, they have proven through this and all the books that I've read that they do not belong in Latin America. They are vicious thugs and white supremacists that only serve to rape and murder the people of Latin America, the Hispanics and, Brazilians in Latin America. That is their only purpose, and that is what they did. So let's keep going, changing command. As early as 1927, when a Nicaraguan proposal to detail American officers to the Guardia for a period of 12 years was rejected, the State Department had made it clear that American control over the Guardia Nacional was to be only temporary. Before withdrawing, the Marines were supported to create an efficient, well-armed, and disciplined fighting force, which would function both as an army and as a national police force. The effort has already been discussed, as has the less successful effort to restore peace and maintain internal security throughout Nicaragua. Finally, the Marines were expected to develop a native officer corps endowed with a spirit of loyalty to the nation and nonpartisanship in domestic politics. Unfortunately, serious efforts to train Nicaraguan officers were not begun until several years after Guardia's creation, but efforts to promote nonpartisanship among enlisted men began almost immediately. In an effort to eliminate partisan politics from the Guardia's ranks, every recruit was forced to take an oath renouncing all political affiliation. Prompt punishment was promised for any who subsequently gave overt expression of preference for one party. In at least one case, an enlisted man was discharged for shouting "vivas" for a particular party. This effort was contrary to Nicaraguan political tradition, but it seems to have been surprisingly successful. One reason for this may have been the Nicaraguan's traditional loyalty to his commanding officer, his jefe. As long as this officer was nonpartisan, the average private found it much easier to avoid political involvement. Any system that depended upon loyalty to an individual was, of course, open to wide abuse should the officers develop their own political ambitions. Repeated efforts were made to transfer the enlarged man's loyalty from the individual officer to the institution that officer represented, but such efforts enjoyed little success, while the development of the Corps of Nicaraguan officers to assume command of the Guardia Nacional was obviously vital for the ultimate success of that organization. It was not until April 1930 that any formal effort was made in this area. That month, the Nicaraguan Military Academy was opened with a staff of 3 Marine officers and a student body of 9 Nicaraguan cadets who were supposed to receive 8 to 9 months of classroom instruction, plus from 1 to 2 months field work. The cadet actually received only a little over 2 months of instruction before increased Sandinista activity forced their premature graduation on June 22, 1930. The lowest ranking member of the class was a former enlisted man, Francisco Gaitan. Despite this unpromising beginning, he would play a greater role in Guardia's future than any of his fellow cadets. By September 30th, 1930, the Guardia still had only 15 Nicaraguan officers out of a total officers' corps of 220, and the task of replacing American officers before the final withdrawal was becoming increasingly imposing. The Academia Militar was expanded with a Nicaraguan graduate of the first class being added to the staff, additional text translated into Spanish, and larger quarters obtained in the Campo del Marte. 97 Nicaraguans applied for admission to the next class, which began in November 1930, but only 37 were accepted, including 4 who were already serving the Guardia as officers. Efforts of the Academe staff to inculcate political partisanship in the cadets were hampered from the start. The Jefe director had ordered the rejection of all applicants who had been involved in recent politics or whose families were notably active in politics. President Moncada, however, had to approve all admissions, and he showed a definite interest in party affiliations, rejecting conservatives and favoring liberals. The studies of this academia class were plagued by constant interruptions. The class spent over a month in the field chasing Sandinistas, then lost their building in the March 1931 earthquake. Despite such setbacks, 27 of the original 38 cadets graduated on June 1st. The graduation still left the majority of the Guardia officers' post filled by Marines. As late as March 1932, the force had only 39 Nicaraguan officers, all of them lieutenants. And the Academia's third class, which entered July 15, 1931, had 187 applications for 75 places. Successful applicants had to pass a battery of academic tests, a physical examination, a security check, and a personal interview. In addition, they had to be between 20 and 35 years old, stand at least 5 feet 4 inches, weigh a minimum of 135 pounds, and submit recommendations from 2 well-known citizens. Because of these requirements, the majority of the Academia's cadets probably came from a small middle-class and artisan sector of Nicaragua's population. Educational requirements eliminated the mass of the populations, and sons of the upper class found little attraction in the life or salary of a second lieutenant. Furthermore, the Liberal Party, whose applicants the president favored, drew its strongest support from urban artisans and businessmen, while wealthy rural families were more likely to support the conservatives. The academia's third class devoted more time to classroom instruction than had its predecessors. The curriculum covered everything from basic military training through law, engineering, and administration to such academic subjects as Nicaraguan history and geography and composition. In addition, in what must have been one of the first operations of its kind, they were airlifted into the Department of Esteli, where they had four contracts with SANDINO's forces and also trained 80 auxiliaries. On April 7, 1932, 59 of the cadets received commissions as Guardia second lieutenants. With the United States committed to ending the intervention and turning over control of the Guardia to Nicaragua by January 1933, the officers' training program was still producing far from adequate results. The size of the academia's final class was expanded to 80, but despite a decrease in the Guardia's officer requirements by using contract physicians, this barely filled the force's company grade officer positions, leaving the problem of field grade officers unsettled. The State Department and the Marine Corps had already devoted considerable effort to finding some solution to this problem. Their final decision would be crucial, as the Guardia's future would be determined by the men who replaced the Marines in the higher ranks. This problem had first appeared in March 1931 when General Calvin B. Matthews, the Guardia's Jeffy director, informed the State Department that he believed the academia could graduate enough officers to fill all except the higher ranks of the Guardia by January 1st, 1933. While the lack of any provision for filling higher positions was clearly implied in this message, it was not until the following February that State Department officials expressed concern over the situation. Lawrence Dugan of the Division of Latin American Affairs discovered that the Guardia had no regular promotion procedures, and there was nothing to prevent the president from appointing all to the high command of his own henchmen, pledged to carry out his personal or party wishes. Dugan urged the rapid creation of a plan for filling these posts and suggested that a phased withdrawal of Marine officers from the Guardia might aid that transition. At last aware of the problem, the State Department in March 1932 asked the American legation for a report on the steps being taken to prepare for Nicaraguan control of the Guardia. The legation reply stated that the present plans called for turning over the higher commands to the Nicaraguans on January 2nd, 1933, the day after the final American withdrawal, in order to allow the incoming Nicaraguan president to commission these officers. The legation also enclosed a proposal by General Matthews that the Nicaraguans adopt a new basic law for their armed forces. Such a law, which would free the Guardia of local political control and prohibit any political participation, including voting, by its officers and men, was seen by Matthews as an absolute prerequisite for the retention of an efficient, well-disciplined force in Nicaragua. Matthews felt that his military position prevented bringing the matter to President Moncada's attention, but that the State Department could indeed must do so. The message was sent to the legation in November 1931, but for some reason was not passed on to the department until April 1932. By then, chances of action on any such law by the Nicaraguan Congress before the Marines withdrew were virtually nil. In a later memorandum, General Matthews pointedly declared that academia graduates had neither the requisite age nor experience for the Guardia's high commands. Therefore, the post of Jeffy director and those of the other field grade officers would have to be filled by Nicaraguans of mature age and previous military experience, chosen by the victor in the 1932 election. The obvious implication in this recommendation was that such Nicaraguans would have acquired the military experience outside the Guardia Nacional and that they would be political supporters of the incoming president. Matthews did suggest that such appointments be made 2 months before withdrawal so that the Marines could give their successors some orientation. The reaction of some State Department officials to this problem seems to have been to engage in wishful thinking rather than to grapple with the realities of Nicaraguan politics. A striking example of this attitude was provided by Acting Secretary of State Francis White in a May 17, 1932 letter to the American minister in Nicaragua. White wrote, It is going to be difficult to maintain the theory of the Guardia as a nonpartisan organization if outsiders are to be appointed to high commands. However, in view of the fact that no Nicaraguans have so far been trained and hold grades higher than that of lieutenant, I suppose it may be necessary to go outside of the Guardia for some of the appointment to higher grades. It would, of course, be advisable if such appointments be given to Nicaraguans who do not have a record of strong political partisanship, and that the appointments be made by General Matthews in order that the present officers and men of the Guardia have confidence in these appointments. Sentiments such as these flew in the face of political realities, and General Matthews had pointed out those appointed to the higher grades would have to have some military experience. The only way anyone outside the Guardia had obtained such experience had been in violently partisan political struggles, making it impossible to fill the positions with Nicaraguans who did not have a record of strong political partisanship. Furthermore, it was extremely unlikely that any Nicaraguan president would willingly give General Matthews or anyone else the power to appoint men who might well be his political enemies to high positions in the armed forces. On June 15, 1932, General Matthews revised his plan for filling the command positions. He pointed out that it would probably be necessary to have the incoming president make these appointments a logical suggestion, since if his predecessor's appointments were unsatisfactory, he would undoubtedly try to change them, precipitating a major conflict within hours after the Marines' final withdrawal. As it would take at least 2 months to appoint these men and prepare them for their positions, Matthews urged the State Department to allow 50 Marine officers to serve with the Guardia for 2 months following the January 1st, 1933 inauguration. Stimson would have nothing to do with this suggestion, declaring that it would not be advisable to leave any Marines in Nicaragua after the date already announced for their withdrawal. While the reasons for this adamant stand are not completely clear, it is probable that Stimson feared that adoption of any such proposal would convince the intervention's critics that the United States was trying to prolong its direct controls over Nicaragua and would lead to increased attacks upon and unfavorable publicity for the department's policies. As an alternative, General Matthews now suggested that the two major presidential candidates should each draw up a list divided equally among conservatives and liberals of candidates for the Guardia's higher posts. As soon as the election was decided, President Moncada should appoint the officers on the winning candidates' lists, thereby giving the Marines almost 2 months to indoctrinate their replacements before the final withdrawal. These suggestions gained rapid State Department approval. Acting Secretary of State Castle declared that besides meeting the department's objections to retention of Americans in the Guardia after January 1st, Matthews' latest plan also provided for continuance of the nonpartisan basis of the Guardia, since its officers will be drawn equally from the two historic parties. The claim was wrong. Instead of continuing the policy of nonpartisanship, the plan signaled the final abandonment of that effort. The agreement later signed by both parties to put this plan into effect, while theoretically providing for a nonpartisan Guardia, first specifically exempted the post of Jeffy director from these provisions, a key omission, then agreed to select the other officers on a bipartisan basis. Bipartisan, however, was not the same as nonpartisan. Under this plan, officers were selected because of their political ties, not because of their lack of them. This ensured that the Guardia's top ranks would be filled by men of definite political loyalties, and that Jeffy director would be picked representatives of the ruling party. This once again placed control of Nicaragua's armed forces in partisan political hands. By 1934, Arthur Bliss Lane, who succeeded Hanna as minister in Nicaragua, saw clearly that the agreement on partisan officer selection had represented a major shift in the United States policy, adding that persons who should be in a position to know tell me the very provision that the number of officers should be equally divided between the two historical political parties is in itself an emphasis upon the political construction of the Guardia. At the time for withdrawal approached, many Nicaraguan political leaders sought some way of prolonging the Marines' presence in their nation. These included the conservative presidential candidate Adolfo Diaz, and surprisingly the Liberals candidate Juan Batista Sacasa, against whom the original intervention had been aimed. Most were alarmed at the prospect of leaving the Guardia in the hands of untried leaders facing a threat from SANDINO, which was, in Minister Hanna's words, fully as strong as, if not stronger than any time since inception. While Hanna probably sympathized with the request for continued Marine presence, Stimson did not. All the American minister could do in response to repeated pleas was to hold out the hope that the American withdrawal would make possible negotiations with Sandino. With the United States determined to pull out on schedule, it only remained to put Matthews' plan into action. President Moncada suggested this be done by having both parties' candidates sign a document pledging to observe the arrangements of appointing higher officers and to continue the Guardia on a nonpartisan basis after January 1st. In addition, Moncada urged that signing taking place in the presence of the State Department representative, explaining that Nicaraguans attach great respect to the simple promise made before the government of the United States. The last suggestion probably represented an effort to commit the United States to enforcement of the agreement, an assumption that Nicaraguans later made repeatedly. The State Department approved these suggestions, and General Matthews sent letters to the leaders of both parties explaining the proposals for drawing up lists of nominees for the Guardia's higher officers and for keeping the Guardia nonpartisan after January 1st. On November 5th, 1932, the day before the election, both candidates, plus General Somoza, acting foreign minister and representative of the Moncada administration, signed the agreement in Hanna's presence. This pledged them to maintain the Guardia as the nation's only armed force, to keep the organization on a nonpartisan basis, a provision which, by the interpretation placed upon it, requiring bipartisanship in selecting and replacing high officers and exempting the Jeffy director from these restrictions, was already negated, and to give the president, in agreement with the Jeffy director, the right to select officers for posts on the general staff. The last apparent obstacle to American withdrawal was the successful holding of the 1932 elections. The State Department was determined to see this done and had earlier firmly rebuffed proposals by Moncada, which would have postponed the elections 2 years, extending his term in office. To direct the Board of Elections, the department chose Rear Admiral Clark H. Woodward, veteran of the Caribbean Service. The selection of a naval officer avoided the possibility of a recurrence of the inter-service rivalries which had plagued the 1928 election supervision, but numerous problems still remained. Admiral Woodward was soon calling for an additional 1,800 Marines to help supervise the elections, a request the State Department found completely impossible to fulfill. After considerable debate, a plan was worked out providing for a mission of 643 American officers and men with no accompanying support forces at a cost of $200,000. But both major parties were plagued with pre-election problems. A bitter dispute within the Liberal Party between President Moncada and former Vice President Sacasa was only resolved under tremendous pressure from Admiral Woodward. The Liberals' nominations ultimately went to Sacasa for president and Rodolfo Espinosa for vice president, but the animosity between Moncada and Sacasa remained unresolved and was destined to have grave consequences in the future. The conservatives were plagued by apathy and lack of funds. They had nominated Adolfo Diaz for president and Emiliano Chamorro for vice president, but later considered joining the coalition with Moncada to back one of his supporters against Sacasa, in return for which Moncada offered the conservatives the vice presidential nomination and half the cabinet post. When this proposal fell through, they even considered withdrawing entirely from the campaign. Under strong American pressure, they ultimately decided to remain in the contest, and the campaign continued. The Liberals won by a wide margin, placing Sacasa in a position he had fought so hard to gain in 1926 to 1927. Considering their lack of funds and enthusiasm, the conservatives did surprisingly well in the congressional races, holding their own in the Chamber of Deputies and actually gaining a seat in the Senate. The Guardia performed well during the elections, drawing praise from Admiral Woodward for their very active and efficient service. Even the defeated conservatives acknowledged that the Guardia and the urban police had remained totally neutral. Perhaps the happiest person to see the elections end was the admiral who, in his final report, suggested that the government of the United States seek by every means possible to avoid again becoming involved in a commitment of the nature of the 3 recent supervisions of elections of Nicaragua. Since Sacasa had won the 1932 elections, supposedly his selections, which would have appointed to the Guardia's higher posts, but these appointments were to be made by President Moncada, who is no friend of Sacasa's. Moncada undoubtedly insisted on a voice in Sacasa's choices, especially for the post of Jefe director. This influence became obvious when the name of the Guardia's first Nicaraguan Jefe director was announced. This man, appointed from a list revised from that originally proposed by Sacasa and approved by both Moncada and Matthew Hanna, was Moncada's longtime protege, Anastasia Somoza Garcia. The American minister also exercised an important influence in Somoza's selection. For years, many Nicaraguans have claimed that Somoza was handpicked by Hanna, a view at least partly confirmed by both Wilford Bullock, Hanna's first secretary of Managua, and Arthur Bliss Lane, his successor as Minister of Nicaragua. As early as October 28, 1932, Hanna informed the State Department of his preference for Somoza, declaring, "I look on him as the best man in the country for the position," and adding that no one will labor as intelligently or conscientiously to maintain the nonpartisan character of the Guardia, or will be as efficient in all matters connected with the administration and command of the force. General Matthews and most of the other Marines holding Guardia command positions also favored Somoza and supported efforts to have him appointed Jefe director. When the appointment was announced, both Hanna and Matthews were clearly pleased, with Hanna claiming that Somoza had previously played a successful part in the 1926-1927 revolutionary movement, a claim certainly open to dispute, and adding that while some criticized the new Jefe director for being too close to Moncada, the appointment was generally applauded here. The pressure from both Moncada and Hanna obviously left Sacasa far from free in his choice of a Jefe director. A letter from General Matthews to Moncada, written November 12, 1932, gives final confirmation of this. Matthews wrote that Sacasa had been given three names: Somoza, General Gustavo Bonza, and General Jose Maria Zelaya, all supporters of Moncada, from which to choose the higher officials. Since Bonza was later appointed to chief of the general staff, Estado Mayor, and since Matthews referred to the choosing officials, not an official, it appears that some unspecified persons virtually forced upon Sacasa the individuals who would fill the higher post, leaving him only a very limited choice. Somoza and Sacasa were related by marriage, as Somoza's wife was Sacasa's niece. So Sacasa probably picked Somoza hoping that this tie would give him more influence than he could otherwise have over either of the other candidates. There is no evidence in official files as to who drew up the list or how it was presented to Sacasa. Recent statements, however, by General Somoza's widow, Donna Salvador de Bale de Somoza, helped fill this gap. According to her, the final choices were agreed upon in a meeting between Moncada and Sacasa. Sacasa had originally wanted to appoint General Carlos Castro Wasmer, but ultimately gave in and agreed to appoint Somoza. Her account, however, still leaves unanswered the question of who drew up the list of possible candidates: Moncada, Hanna, General Matthews, or some combination of these. It is not likely that General Matthews would take such action without first gaining the approval of the American minister, but aside from this condition, it remains impossible to fix final responsibility. What is clear is that Somoza was certainly not Sacasa's first choice, creating a situation that favored the rapid development of a breach between the new Nicaraguan president and the commander of his armed forces. Under the terms of the November 5, 1932 agreement, Guardia field grade positions below the rank of Jefe director were to be equally divided between liberals and conservatives. However, in addition to Somoza, 3 out of 5 colonels and 6 out of 8 majors appointed by Sacasa were liberals, treating a liberal party domination over the Guardia from the start of Sacasa's administration. A few minor problems remained before the final turnover of Nicaraguan control on January 1st, 1933. Both Dr. Sacasa and General Somoza made a final plea for retention of all American military mission after that date. Word of their efforts leaked to the press, which attacked the project as an American plot to avoid complete withdrawal. Hanna reiterated the State Department's determination to end all direct involvement with the Guardia on schedule, noting that any suggestion to the contrary was political dynamite in Nicaragua. The people also criticized the American role in endorsing the November 5th bi-party agreements on the Guardia, saying this represented continued United States control over the Guardia. Pressures were brought to bear upon both Diaz and Sacasa to abrogate the agreement, with some conservatives going so far as to claim the party should have nothing to do with the success or failure of the Guardia under a liberal administration. Nothing came of these efforts, and plans for American withdrawal continued on schedule. The Marines gave the new officers a rush, 2-week course that was strictly military, concentrating upon such practical matters as organization, techniques of command, and principles of combat. After this, the new officers picked up their uniforms and equipment and left for their duty stations throughout Nicaragua. Concentration of Marine officers in a few key cities took place from December 13th to December 15th, and as Americans evacuated their posts, the command was given over to the Nicaraguans. General Matthews and his staff busied themselves preparing a large body of proposed laws governing the Guardia Nacional, which they turned over to the President Moncada in December. By then, it was too late for his administration to act upon them, and no subsequent administration ever tried to secure their adoption. On January 1st, 1933, the history of Marine leadership of the Guardia Nacional came to an end. General Matthews attended Sacasa's inauguration, then immediately turned over command of the Guardia to Somoza and departed, leaving in such a rush that his chief of staff doubts that he had time to finish packing. The following day, the last Marines boarded transports to Corinto, leaving the future of Guardia Nacional in Nicaraguan hands. From a strictly military standpoint, the more than 5 years of American leadership had given Nicaragua a better trained, disciplined, and equipped army than it had ever known. The Guardia possessed 259 machine guns, 54 Thompson machine guns, 23 automatic rifles, and 4,474 of the standard Krag rifles. Despite the limited time available, the Academia military graduates were better trained than any previous group of Nicaraguan officers. For the first time, a Nicaraguan army had organized separate medical, communications, and quartermasters departments. There were, however, weaknesses as well as strengths. Sandino was still unbeaten and capable of waging a determined battle for control of the nation. The Guardia was now left without air support, a loss many Nicaraguans felt quite keenly. The withdrawal also meant the closing of the Académie Militaire, leaving the nation with no regular procedure for training new officers. Finally, the appointment of outsiders to the higher ranks produced considerable discontent among the academia graduates who had hoped to obtain the least of these posts themselves. The rift in these officer corps would have serious consequences within a few weeks. From a political standpoint, the net result of American training of the Guardia was quite unsatisfactory. In a statement marking the American withdrawal from Nicaragua, Secretary of State Stimson claimed that the United States had successfully developed efficient, nonpartisan Guardia Nacional. He declared that the force was well-disciplined and, quote, grounded upon the fundamental precept of service to the country as a whole. But this statement was far from accurate. Already many people in the State Department and the Marine Corps were aware that the Guardia was rapidly destined to become a partisan political instrument. As early as December 1929, Walter Thurston, former charge in Nicaragua, warned the State Department that if Moncada insisted upon introducing large number of liberals into the Guardia, and if the Liberal Party press continued to attack the force, there would be very little hope for it. Lawrence Dugan was even more pessimistic 2 years later, observing that the animosity between Nicaragua's traditional parties made it impossible to establish a partisan constabulary, and asking what he had ever prompted American officials to think it might be possible to create such a force. By March 1932, Dugan's pessimism regarding the future of the Guardia Nacional had increased even further. In a memorandum for Edward Wilson, chief of the Latin American Division, Dugan made a remarkably accurate prediction when he wrote, "Upon the withdrawal of the Marine officers of the Guardia next fall, the force's disintegration will be set into action, which will eventually impair the present organization and the spirit de corps of that body. It is a foregone conclusion that Nicaragua will not maintain the Guardia along present Marine Corps lines. The loss of the spirit of impartial service, so laboriously instilled, involves a return to partisan political constabulary. Judging from the historical position of the army in Central America, and more particularly in Nicaragua, a strictly nonpartisan military organization is not, at the present, time a possibility. While Dugan's pessimism may not have been shared by everyone in the State Department, even Francis White was forced to admit that it would be difficult to maintain the theory of the Guardia as a nonpartisan organization if outsiders are appointed to high commands. The Marines also had evidence that it would be impossible to keep the Guardia nonpartisan after they withdrew. A group of conservative politicians openly told the Marines that there were conservatives in the Guardia posing as liberals who would deliver arms and ammunition to the conservatives after the Marines left. The fact that conservatives had to pose as liberals demonstrated that Guardia already had a pro-liberal bias, while the willingness of some officers to turn over arms to political compatriots outside of the force demonstrated that in at least some cases, efforts to replace party with national loyalty had failed. Further confirmations of these conditions came with an October 1932 intelligence reports. This noted a general consensus that some sort of revolutionary upheaval after the Marines' departures was inevitable, and that the present composition and organization of the Guardia Nacional would not long survive the American withdrawal. Similar conclusions were expressed independently by at least one prominent former Guardia officer, Lieutenant Colonel Robert Denning, who had served as Guardia's chief of staff in 1931. In the November 32 issue of the Marine Corps Gazette, he criticized the plan for appointing Guardia officers after the 1932 election, then went on to observe, "At best, there is sure to be a shake-up in the Guardia. It will soon become a partisan force used to further the party in power. Political considerations, as well as the memories of the fate of the officers, such as General Phelan, who had previously criticized State Department policy, evidently kept Marines on active duty within the Guardia from making too blunt statements about their views on the Guardia's future or pressing these views on the American legation. The critical statements concerning the Guardia made by the Marine Corps Commandant General B.H. Fuller before a House committee in 1931 unleashed a storm of criticism and led Fuller to write that he would not have spoken so freely if he had known his statements would be made public. In private correspondence, however, Fuller defended his views, adding, "It takes a good while to make a good soldier out of anybody, and it takes much longer to make one out of a Nicaraguan. A National Guard would be very inefficient under present circumstances if it were offered by anybody but Americans." Even General Matthews, the Guardia's last American commander, gave a measure of support for the gloomy forecast concerning the Guardia's future, admitting that the best that could be hoped for in the newly appointed officers was a minimum, not a lack of political bias. He also acknowledged that such bias was already present in the Guardia, since Moncada had rejected many qualified academia candidates solely on the ground of political or family ties, and even made Matthews investigate the enlistments of conservatives at private. The Jeffy director added that everyone was familiar with these conditions. In the face of the evidence, the State Department continued to work for agreements supposedly designed to maintain a nonpartisan Guardia after the Marines withdrew. Such efforts were doomed to failure. The failure was underlined by the acquiescence and even support which the department gave to the proposed exempting the Jeffy director from the nonpartisan status specified for the Guardia Nacional. It is ironic that in this agreement designed to ensure the continuance of the Guardia on a bipartisan basis after withdrawal, the clause exempting the Jeffy director from this requirement was drafted not by the Nicaraguans, but by the American legation. The United States had given Nicaragua the best trained and equipped army it had ever known, but it had also given that nation an instrument potentially capable of crushing political opposition with greater efficiency than ever before in that nation. The Guardia had been envisioned as an instrument for ending the tradition of using the military for partisan political purposes, yet before the Marines left, partisanship had already entered its ranks with the acquiescence of the State Department. In addition, the danger of the break between the new Jeffy director and the Nicaraguan president existed before either of them had even taken office. This represented the real heritage left by the United States when the Marines turned over command of the Guardia. Under these conditions, the violent upheavals that occurred in Nicaragua during the ensuing 4 years came as no surprise to many American veterans of the intervention. So that's the end of that chapter, changing command. So we see, in summary, like the from a bird's eye view, or from the big view, is that the machine guns. What did the America accomplish here? They gave them a lot of machine guns. They gave them 259 machine guns, 54 Thomas submachine guns, 23 Browning automatic rifles, and 4,474 of the standard Krag rifles. So they gave them a lot of weapons. So this is what America does. It gives a lot of weapons. The peaceful Hispanic people of Nicaragua were given a lot of weapons to the political oligarchy, the political structure there. And so what did they do? They murdered the people. That's ultimately what America does. They're rapists. They're white supremacists, rapists, and murderous butchers. And that's what they did in Nicaragua. So they give the machine guns, the weapons, and then they give the peaceful people that are there, the indigenous people, the will to murder, others to resolve disputes. It's the same as America. It's a gun violent group of whites. The American government is a gun violent group of fascist white thugs. I mean, they are like a mafia, white supremacist mafia. They just, extend their mafia and reach across the world because they are gun violent, arrogant thugs. Their Nicaraguan example is a failure. It's a failed intervention. It is a lack of respect. It is a murder of the Hispanic people there, and it is a complete lack of respect. There is no prestige for the American government. The prestige was completely gone by this intervention in Nicaragua. They, have no respect in Latin America. And as I said, again, I don't believe they belong in Latin America. They do not belong in Latin American politics. Not only are they not cognizant of the culture and the people and the land, but they are also gun violent thugs. They rely on rape and murder and torture to enact their success. And that's what they do everywhere. Rape, murder, and torture. The U.S. government is, experts on it. Like I say always, the U.S. government are experts in weaponry, rape, murder, and torture. Anything other than that, they just bring it into that, algorithm. So if it requires, mental health, they bring rape, murder, and torture as the way to deal with mental health. You shoot the people, and that's how you resolve mental illness. Somoza was mentally ill. The U.S. government didn't recognize that. They gave him guns. That's how they did it. They gave him guns. So this delusional, mentally ill thug could go around murdering its people. It's the same as the U.S. government, the same setup. So continuing on, we had, some choices. We had some choices. So let's just go through. Many Nicaraguan political leaders tried to prolong the Marines' presence in the nation, but they did not. They refused to go. Bipartisan, it was very clear this organization was not going to be bipartisan. This was not going to be a nonpartisan group of people. The National Guard became basically a, political instrument. It became a political instrument of the ruling elite and the United States government, right? They became friends with Somoza. And so they let this go on for 40 years until the Sandinistas finally said enough is enough. And then they got the courage to fight it. And then you had Reagan come in and, slaughter the Sandinistas, another, racist, rapist, white supremacist, rapist and murderer of the U.S. government. Again and again, the same kind of thing. They did the same kind of thing here. So we saw Juan Batista Sacasa, Hannah, the idea of who made Somoza as part of the, the person to be picked. That was a question. There were three people that were possibly responsible for that. Sacasa had wanted Carlos Castro Wasmer, but he agreed to Somoza. Okay, the operation was either, you were going to have Somoza, basically Somoza. Recent statements are for General Somoza's widow, Donna Salvador de Belda Somoza, helped fill this gap. According to her, the final choices were agreed upon in a meeting between Mangada and Sacasa. Okay, Sacasa had wanted Carlos Castro Wasmer, but ultimately agreed to Somoza. Hannah, General Matthews, and Mancada, or some combination of these three, made the list of candidates. Nobody knows whether the U.S. government, General Matthews, actually, provided this as the person to be in charge. Nobody even knows if this was like a deliberate subversive action that the U.S. government did, because they are, this is their way in Latin America. They are, not belonging in Latin America. They're, vicious thugs. They're vicious thugs and, white supremacist mafia. And their approach to, Latin America explains that. They had three people. They could have subverted it and put, Somoza in power because Somoza was the most ruthless of the people. Ultimately, the United States, again, as they do everywhere else, they wash themselves clean. They wash their hands by withdrawing and leave the murders to the people. They give them the machine guns and say, go right ahead to the Hispanics, go right ahead and take care of your government. We're agreeing with whatever you do, however you resolve it, however it happens, we're okay with it. That's what they do. That they did that all over Latin America, right? They give you the machine guns, they give the military the machine guns and say, you resolve it the way you want, we're okay with it, right? That's the way to do it. You give it to a few people with a lot of money and you give them the machine guns and then they murder the people. They use your weapons to murder the people. It's again the same thing. The American government is fixated on its murders, its rapes, and its tortures. That's all they're interested in doing. That's all they're interested in promoting across Latin America, and they did it over and over again. And Augusto Pinochet, Castillo Branca, Batista, Juan Batista, Venezuela, Carlos, Jimenez in Venezuela. All of these people were examples of U.S. government, giving the machine guns to the military, giving the machine guns to a few select people, and then they murder the people, and that's how they keep order. No interest in the culture of the Hispanic people. You just give the guns to the people and you murder the people. That's the U.S. government. Again, we say they are, white supremacists. They're criminally insane, butchers. They're criminally insane, murderous white butchers. And, no one will be able to explain why they did this thing, but they are responsible for the failure in Nicaragua. Again, another failure of U.S. intervention in Nicaragua, another failed action of American capitalism, and another destabilization by the U.S. government and meddling by the U.S. government. Let's go on to Somoza takes charge. The Marines were gone from Nicaragua in January 1933, but Augusto Cesar Sandino remained, and according to the American minister, was as strong as, if not stronger than any time in the past. The continued struggle against him was exhausting the nation and draining government revenues, already reduced by the effects of the Depression. Ending this conflict was obviously the most important task facing the new Casa administration. The appointment of Sofonias Salvatierra, an educator who was related to Sandino and had reportedly once been his choice for president of Nicaragua as Sacasa's Minister of Agriculture and Labor, proved the key to opening negotiations with the rebel leader. Salvatierra had written Sandino asking for his proposals for a peaceful peace settlement. Sandino replied on December 24th, 1932, indicating a willingness to enter into formal peace arrangement negotiations with a commission authorized by the Sacasa administration. Acting on Sacasa's instructions, Salvatierra proceeded to organize a party of prominent Nicaraguans, including Sandino's father, and set off the Segovias to initiate peace negotiations. As he was preparing to leave, the government needed to end the fighting became even more urgent. Within a week after the departure of the Marines, a major plot had been discovered among the officers of the Guardia Nacional. The fight against Sandino had continued unabated during the first weeks of January, and at least one pitched battle taking place between the Guardia unit and a guerrilla force estimated at 300 men, which had tried to seize the town of San Isidora. The problem was so severe that Somoza was forced to bring back Juan Escamilla, the Mexican adventurer who had commanded a Voluntario force in 1929, and send him back in the field with a force of 100 auxiliaries. The Guardians' combat effectiveness was severely limited by the anger of many Academia military graduates over having the Guardia's higher positions awarded to political appointees. The graduates had received some promotions during the turnover of Nicaraguan command, with several being made captains and all officers who had graduated prior to the 1932 being at least promoted to the rank of first lieutenant. The promotions had not satisfied many of the officers, and they had organized a plot to force the Casa to dismiss all the political appointees except Somoza and appoint Academia graduates to replace them. The plot was discovered at the last minute, narrowly averting a confrontation which might well have created chaos in the Guardia and perhaps even have thrown open the path to power for Sandino. Once discovered, the plot was diffused by arresting the two suspected ringleaders and offering concessions to the other Academia graduates. The American minister was greatly impressed with the speed, wisdom, and tact exhibited by Somoza in dealing with the situation, but feared that the danger might simply be dormant rather than actually resolved. Since almost all the lower-ranking officers were Academia graduates, this meant they had controlled most of the combat units and arms of the Guardia, making any move against them extremely dangerous. In this critical situation, Sacasa did what Nicaraguan presidents had done for decades. He sent for the American minister and, accompanied by Somoza, asked for legation solutions. Much to their surprise, Hannah refused to do more than listen sympathetically and make a few simple suggestions. The United States had determined to return the major responsibility for solving Nicaraguan problems, even those created by U.S. intervention, to the Nicaraguan government. It would take the Nicaraguans several years to get accustomed to this change. Not daring to use force against the de-affected officers, Somoza and Sacasa finally decided simply to transfer the suspected ringleaders. One of them was shipped off to Leon, where he would be closely watched by General Abunza, the Guardia's chief of staff. Another suspect, Captain Gaitan, was sent to Puerto Cabezas, effectively isolating him from contact with the great majority of the officers. Somoza then sought to obtain loyalty pledges from the graduates of the field, and President Sacasa appointed emergency officers to remain on duty in the Campo del Marte in case of an uprising. The threatened revolt was probably ultimately averted as much by dramatic developments in the negotiation with Sandino as by any of the government's actions. On January 23rd, Salvatierra returned to Managua bearing Sandino's peace proposals, and Sacasa declared a 15-day truce to facilitate further negotiations. The threat of a peace treaty with their common enemy, Sandino, may well have restored at least a measure of internal unity among the Guardia's forces. Sandino's original peace terms included demands for an end to foreign intervention in the Guardia Nacional, the creation of a huge new department in the north, stretching from the Segovas to the Atlantic, where his men would retain the arms and appoint all officials, the destruction of all government records, referring to himself of his men as bandits, and by calling a Pan-American conference to revise the Bryan Chamorro Treaty. Sacasa could not accept such terms, but feared that Sandino might launch an offensive with the internally divided Guardia, low on arms and ammunitions, could not handle. He sought credits from the American War Department to purchase additional war materials, but was refused because Nicaragua was badly in default on previous credits. He finally managed to obtain some supplies from Salvador, and at a cost of $11 each, 2,000 used Krag Jorgensen rifles from private New York firms. By the time this transaction was completed, Sandino had agreed to the terms. Salvatierra had returned to Sandino's headquarters in the hills above San Rafael del Norte, covering the last few miles on a mule furnished by the Guardia. Upon his arrival, Sandino informed him that he decided to go to Managua to negotiate directly with President Sacasa. The news was promptly wired to Managua, and a plane was dispatched to take the guerrilla leader to the capital. Sandino reached Managua on February 2nd, claiming that all Nicaraguans, including his troops and members of the Guardia, were brothers, an attitude he emphasized by writing to the presidential palace in General Somoza's automobile. Once there, his delegates and the government began intensive work on peace terms, reaching an agreement shortly before midnight. The terms called for an immediate cessation of all hostilities, a complete amnesty for all of the guerrillas, and a partial disarmament of Sandino's men, with Salvatierra's collecting the arms. Sandino was to retain enough arms for a force of 100 men who were to preserve order in an area along the Rio Coco, where his supporters could settle and farm on public lands. The government agreed to pay the expenses of this force for 1 year. At the end of that time, the status of the force was to be reviewed. The government agreed to undertake a public works program in the northern area, giving special job preferences to Sandino's followers. Sandino and his supporters agreed to obey the government and preserve peace and order in their section of Nicaragua. The signing of this piece of the treaty set off a period of public rejoicing. The leading newspapers of both parties hailed the event. Somoza and Sandino embraced. Sacasa issued a proclamation praising the treaty, and Sandino even declared that he had never believed that the United States' actions in Nicaragua represented the actual sentiment of most Americans, and that he had no hostility toward Americans who came to Nicaragua to work, providing they did not come as bosses. On February 3rd, Sandino flew back to tell his followers about the treaty, leaving behind a nation apparently united in acceptance of the peace terms. Somoza may have embraced Sandino in public, but in private, the Jeffy director and many of his subordinates were unhappy with the terms. The Guardia had been busily engaged in recruiting 1,250 auxiliaries, and many officers felt that this force could and should have been used to destroy Sandino. Somoza shared this view and was even more upset by Sandino's being allowed to surrender his arms to his friend Salfania Salvatierri instead of the Guardia. These attitudes within the Guardia boded ill for Nicaragua's future. Some of Sandino's men were also unhappy with the treaty, but the rebel leader promptly crushed this by shooting the two men he felt were most responsible. Sacasa kept his part of the terms, pushing in appropriations for $120,000 for the promised public works through projects through the Congress, and sending Salvatierri to San Rafael del Norte to collect Sandino's arms. Somoza and the Guardia objections to Salvatierri's role in this procedure increased as the task progressed. By the disarmament's conclusion in early March, only 330 to 489 rifles, 18 to 21 machine guns, and 3129 rounds of ammunition had been collected. The government returned to Sandino all the machine guns, all the ammunition, and nearly 100 rifles for use of his own emergency force. The small amount of weapons collected led Somoza to suspect that the guerrillas has hidden most of their arms for future use. Since between 1,800 and 3,000 men were involved in the disarmament, it does appear that considerably fewer arms than might reasonably have been expected were turned in. Shortly after the peace treaty was signed, the Guardia began to experience renewed budget problems. La Noticia, the Liberal Party's organ in Managua, began a campaign to separate the Guardia and the police and to cut the Guardia's budget, which had reached the astonishing total for Nicaragua of $116,000 per month. General Somoza responded that the large force of the auxiliaries were responsible for most of the increase in the Guardia costs and proceeded to dismiss all but 100 of the 1,409 men in this category. Far from being satisfied, La Noticia broadened its attacks to include denunciations of Guardia Fueros, which gave its members immunity from civil prosecution. The attacks increased in April when Congress began debating the 1934 budget. La Noticia now argued that one way to cut the budget was to reduce officer salaries, cutting the Jeffy director from $300 to $200 a month, and reducing the pay of all other officers down to a minimum of $40 each month for second lieutenants. Conservatives seemed more concerned about the Guardia's composition than about its cost. Their fears in this area were increased when Sacasa, shortly after his inauguration, brought 300 hand-picked liberals to the Guardia, using them to double the Managua garrison. General Chamorro went to President to request information about the political affiliation of Guardia troops and to complain about alleged abuses that soldiers were committing against conservatives. Sacasa refused to give him any information, and only the intervention of the American minister won for the conservative leader the right to confer with General Somoza about matters concerning the Guardia. With leaders in both parties unhappy, it was not surprising that the budget debate in the Nicaraguan Congress produced sharp attacks on the Guardia. One deputy proposed cutting the force to 1,500 men. Another wanted to cut it to 300 and replace the most areas by hacienda guards, while a third urged that it be abolished and replaced by the traditional pre-1927 Nicaraguan army. A budget providing $9,000 a month for the Guardia was finally passed in June. At almost the same time, trouble with Sandino began once again. Conflict between Sandino and the Guardia had been threatening for months. In May, Sandino objected to the establishment of a Guardian post only 25 miles from his territory. When the president refused to move it, he offered to leave the country, but Sacasa discouraged him from doing this. Sandino then began attacking the Guardia Nacional as an institution, charging that the organization was unconstitutional, an enemy of the government and of his men, then demanding that it be reformed and brought in line with the Constitution, or that the president arm the civilian population to protect their liberties. For the Guardia, such charges represented a basic threat to their existence. The seeds of conflict were being nurtured by both sides and would soon produce an open clash. Meanwhile, the continued dismissal of the auxiliaries from the government service had reduced by July 1st the number of men under Guardia control to 2,891. While this represented a considerable decrease from the peak strength of over 4,000, which had been reached in February, it was still larger than at any time during the American intervention. Expenses were also being trimmed because of the continued decline in the nation's economy. General Somoza in July reduced the salary of all officers. The Jeffy director himself took the largest cut, dropping from 300 to 260 a month. Colonels were cut from 175 to 150, and second lieutenants from 75 to 70. Despite such actions, widespread criticism of the Guardia costs continued. Increasing tension was suddenly revealed in August 1933 when a series of violent explosions, the main arsenal in Managua, was destroyed. The explosions rattled windows all over the city and gave an equal shaking to government nerves. Congress immediately declared a state of war in Managua and a state of siege throughout the rest of the nation, and Sacasa gave government arms to 700 liberals in Leon and ordered the arrest of 300 leading conservatives. Protestations of innocents and attacks on these actions led to the imposition of press censorship. One of the most significant responses came from Sandino, who wired an offer to come to the government aid with 600 armed men, explaining that he had obtained arms for the extra 500 from the recently defeated Honduran rebels. The offer was refused as no help was needed, but it must have been extremely upsetting to Somoza and the Guardia to discover that Sandino could raise a force of 600 armed men almost overnight. It was soon obvious that the conservatives had nothing to do with the explosion, but Sacasa did not release the last of the political prisoners until August 18th and did not lift the censorship until September 13th. Both Matthew Hanna and General Somoza were upset by the president's response to the incident, which they felt only led to increased attacks upon the Guardia. Hanna reported that Sacasa's fear of internal disorder had steadily increased until it had become an unreasonable fear amounting to an obsession. At the same time, the American minister had only praised for Somoza's action, which he had felt kept the Guardia loyal and its posts in spite of serious difficulties, one of which was the government's failure to pay Guardia's salaries for June or July. Somoza had good reason to keep the Guardia at its assigned duties. With the officer corps still divided and Sandino free in the mountains with a potential force of at least 600 armed men, the Jeffy director could hardly afford an open break with the president. Somoza was ambitious but not foolhardy, and he would maintain at least a semblance of loyalty to Sacasa until he felt the time was right for a complete takeover. Somoza still did not dare to move against the academia graduates, but there was one other element within the officer corps that he did not trust and wanted to remove. These were the conservative officers appointed under the bipartisan agreements. In October 1933, two of these loyal, Colonel Jose Andre Urchico and Major Gustavo Lachoya, command chief and the auxiliar of the Guardia's law department, were tried on a charge of infidelity in confidential military correspondence. The charges revolved around a letter written by Somoza, which contained some very caustic criticisms of Vice President Somoza. Somoza gave this letter to Urteco and Lacayo for safekeeping, and a few days later it showed up in Espinosa's hand. Major Lacayo agreed to resign and charges against him were dropped, but Colonel Urteco insisted that he was being framed as part of a plot to drive conservatives out of the Guardia. In making his defense, Urteco pointed out that since the arsenal's explosion, he had been without a safe which he could open, and added that he wanted to embarrass Somoza, he could have used much more incriminating documents. Despite his pleas, he was found guilty by the court-martial and sentenced to bad conduct discharge. Somoza changed to a simple discharge for the convenience of the government. Managua's leading liberal newspaper used this case as an excuse for an editorial attack on the idea of trying to create a nonpartisan army, an effort which the editor described as a bad experience. Effort to destroy the last shreds of nonpartisanship within the Guardia also received support from the Sacasa administration. In December, the Minister for Foreign Affairs, Dr. Leonardo Arguello, denounced the agreements to keep the Guardia bipartisan, declaring the communists might use them in some unspecified manner to provoke disturbances. Arguello's remedy for this was a complete reorganization of the Guardia, a proposal for which he sought but failed to obtain American approval. In November, President Sacasa contracted malaria and went to his coffee plantation, El Cantano, to recover. His illness raised rumors of an impending clash between the president and the military. The rumors gained strength when Gary Rivas, editor of La Nueva Prensa, suggested that the Guardia take over all powers of the state and assume in its budget the duties of a cabinet ministry. Rivas quoted the Guardia's chief of staff as saying that Franklin Roosevelt's new Latin American policy allowed the Guardia to abrogate the bipartisan agreements. Abrogate meaning end the bipartisan agreement. All this alarmed Sandino, who in mid-November flew to Managua to seize the casa. Tension between the Sandinistas and the Guardia had been steadily increasing in recent months. In August, 5 of Sandino's followers were killed by a National Guardia patrol, an incident the Guardia blamed on the failure of Sandino men to inform them that they would be in the area. Somoza had been reportedly protesting continued government payments for and ammunition shipments to Sandino's troops in the north. At one point, he had even told President Sacasa, "I will not permit this to go on, and you will be guilty of what happens." The conversations held by Sandino, first with Sacasa at his coffee plantation, and later with Somoza in Managua, eased the tension. Declarations from Sandino pledging to respect the legal authorities of the government and from Somoza ordering the Guardia not to molest Sandino's men were published on December 5. These declarations, however, produced only a brief lull before the final confrontation in 1934. At this critical time, a new American minister, Arthur Bliss Lane, replaced Matthew Hanna as American minister to Nicaragua. This removed from Managua a man who was probably too close to Somoza, but who might have been able to exercise some control over the general during the coming crisis with Sandino. This was Lane's first post as minister, and he would find it a hectic, at times dangerous, and often frustrating experience. Sometime Sandino left Managua on December 9. That same day, Lane heard from Somoza of yet another clash between the Guardia and the Sandinista. Lane described the general's tone when discussing Sandino as very hostile. A few days later, General Estrada, commander of Sandino's troops, arrived in Managua to request additional arms and ammunition. To grant the request would infuriate the Guardia and strengthen Sandino, but refusal might lead the guerrillas to resume the war. Caught between the two unpleasant prospects, President Sacasa did nothing. While he procrastinated, the situation rapidly got worse. Sandino's representative in Managua, Dr. Sabetta, told Lane that Sandino might have announced that Sandino might have to protect the president from the Guardia, while Somoza announced that Sandino would have to give up his remaining arms in February, as 1 year would have elapsed since the signing of the peace treaty. Somoza added that he expected the president to give in if Sandino refused to disarm and complained that the Guardia had not been permitted to finish Sandino. The key to the dispute was the demand that Sandino give up his arms. Both Somoza and Sacasa claimed that he was obliged to do this on the anniversary of the peace treaty. Actually, the treaty only gave the government the right to reduce the number of men under Sandino and to change their officers after 1 year, a right which could be used to disarm them if the administration so choose. Somoza's demand for the surrender of the arms was originally published in the journal Guardia Nacional and reprinted on February 4th, 1935, issue of La Noticia. According to Jeffy, director of Sandino, failed to keep his promise and give up his arms. This would create an intolerable situation of a state existing within a state. But if he did disarm, he was promised protection of his rights and safety. Somoza even offered to incorporate some of Sandino's men into local military units. No action was specified if he failed to disarm, but it was clear that Guardia would take some action. The situation created numerous problems for the new American minister, Arthur Bliss Lane. Nicaraguans of all factions constantly approached him, seeking advice or approval for their own plans. Since any official expression of American views was regarded in Nicaragua as an important factor, Lane found it virtually impossible for us to give advice, even in a discreet manner, without assuming responsibility for the advice given. This problem became even more acute when on February 9th, Somoza told Lane that if I would only give my word, he would lock Sandino up. The American minister expressed strong disapproval of any such action and secured Somoza's promise not to do anything without first having your Lane's approval. While the Guardia's attitude was growing progressively more belligerent, Sandino was continuing his attacks on that organization, denouncing it as illegal and unconstitutional and demanding its immediate reform. On January 26, he wrote President Sacasa, refusing to give up any of his arms and declaring that he would protect the president from the unconstitutional Guardia Nacional. The letter's threatening tone at last forced Acosta to take some action. He finally refused Sandino's request for more arms and ammunition, but instead of again demanding that the guerrillas disarm, he simply required that Sandino come to Managua to discuss the situation. Tulane, this indicated that the president was more afraid of the Guardia than he was of Sandino. The invitation was accepted, although Sandino commented the trip was unnecessary, as everything had already been settled. The decision to return to center of Somoza's power would cost him his life. On January 31st, 1934, La Noticia reported the highly secret meeting of the Guardia officers from all over the nation was going on in Managua. The commanders arrived from as far away as Bluefield, but the newspaper was unable to discover the reason for the meeting. Given the approaching deadline that Somoza had set for Sandino's disarmament, it seems obvious that the meeting concerned plans for future actions against the guerrilla leader. According to two of the officers present, Somoza opposed killing Sandino, but was overruled by a junta of other officers led by General Abunzo and Colonel Santos. Sandino's decision to come to Managua gave the Guardia a golden opportunity to carry out this decision. When Sandino arrived in the capital on February 16th, he found the city in a state of extreme tension. A few days before, Somoza had again promised that the Guardia would be loyal and would take no action that might embarrass the president, but Lane doubted the degree of control that the Jeffy director had over his fellow officers. The situation in the north had also become very tense, and later was informed that Guardia troops in the area seemed to be seeking a pretext to attack the Sandinistas. It was clear that the situation would have been resolved before Sandino could ever leave Managua. I'm going to take a small break. I'm going to take a short break. I'm glad you could join us today. Okay, continuing on. Despite the obvious danger, Sandino was in a far from conciliatory mood. He again characterized the Guardia as an unconstitutional agency, declared he would never turn over his arms to it, and demanded its immediate reform. Finally accused it of killing 17 of his men in the past year and arresting many more, but added that he did not want war and would consider going abroad and issuing a manifesto if the conflict could not be resolved. These statements infuriated Somoza, and during lunch with Arthur Bliss Lane, he asked the American envoy to wink my eye so he could lock up Sandino. He got a decidedly negative response from the minister, who had him repeat the promise not to move against Sandino. Somoza issued Sandino a safe conduct pass, then joined Lane at a baseball game, an event later cited by those who accused them of conspiring together. On February 10th, Sandino's position apparently hardened still further. In a letter to the president, he attacked the Guardia as a military institution with regulations foreign to our fundamental charter, while at the same time he claimed that his own force was completely constitutional and belonged to President Sacasa. He demanded that the government guarantee the constitutionality of the Guardia and the lives and interests of his supporters. Somehow, in the hours between the dispatch of this letter and Sacasa's reply the following day, a compromise was achieved. Sacasa announced his determination to bring the Guardia into line with the Constitution during the first 6 months of 1934. He also agreed to appoint a presidential delegate for the northern area who would protect the interests of Sandino and his followers while the Guardia was being reformed, and would also collect all the arms which may have be found outside the control of the government. In the crucial matter of selecting the delegate, the president gave in completely to Sandino, appointing one of his advisors, General Horatio Portocarrero. This satisfied Sandino, but not Somoza, who made no effort to disguise his anger. He wrote the president that he had done everything humanly possible in complying with my duty for the purpose of preventing the disturbances which this type of appointment would bring, adding that if Portocarrero were appointed, he would not be responsible for the consequences. The Jeffy director complained to Bliss Lane that the appointment was an insult to the Guardia. and that it would make his troops in the north subject to Sandino's control. He then asked the American minister to do something about the situation, adding that the Guardia had almost gotten out of control over the incident, but if Lane would just let him lock up Sandino, everything would be settled. Lane refused to do this, but agreed to investigate the situation. Lane was informed that Portocarrero had become quite disillusioned with Sandino and would be totally loyal to the Sacasa administration. The minister carried this report to Somoza, who again promised to personally do nothing, but added that his force would still be furious at the insult and the things that had reached the point where he could not longer control the Guardia. The president was greatly upset over the Guardia's attitude, which he characterized as nothing short of revolt. But since, as Lane observed, he had little control over Somoza, and Somoza's own control over the military was rather dubious, Sacasa could do nothing about the situation except complain. The conflict between Sandino and the Guardia reached its climax on the night of February 21st. That evening, two different meetings were held in Managua. At the presidential palace, Sacasa and Sofanis Salvatierra were having a farewell dinner for Sandino and his supporters, including General Umanzar and Estrada. At about 10 o'clock, Salvatierra, Sandino, Umanzar, and Estrada left in Salvatierra's order. The other meeting had broken up shortly before this. It had been held in the Campo del Marte, and most of the Guardia's higher-ranking officers, including General Somoza and Abunza, had been present. All available sources agree that those present decided to move immediately against Sandino, and no one denies that Somoza was the one who eventually gave the order to shoot Sandino. There is, however, no agreement on how they arrived at this decision. Somoza, in a ghost-written account, claims that the meeting only decided to arrest Sandino, and the decision to kill him was made only after he had been seized. Other accounts dispute this. According to one account, the decision to kill Sandino was taken at the meeting, and it was to Somoza who urged it. The Jeffy director reported to claim that he had gained American approval for the elimination of Sandino. The Jeffy director reported to claim that he had gained American approval for the elimination of Sandino, an action which the other officers present confirmed and set about to accomplish. For two high-ranking officers directly involved in the meeting contradict this account. They claim that the officer corps had to force a frightened Somoza to agree to Sandino's death. Somoza did not want to spare Sandino because of any fondness for the guerrilla leader, but because of fear over the consequences that his murder might entail. A more recent account written by former Guardia officers does claim that Lane and Somoza met several times on February 24th, then adds interesting detail that Somoza and General Abunza managed to lock up all uninvolved Guardia officers in Managua at a poetry recital, assuring them there would be no military opposition to their actions. This account pictures Abunza as, at the least, considerably more determined than Somoza to proceed with the murder. However, the decision was made. Its results were obvious. A strong Guardia patrol blocked the road from Presidential Palace to downtown Managua at the point where it passed Campo del Marte and the National Penitentiary. As Salvatierra's car approached this point, it was ordered to halt and was immediately surrounded by armed troops, who ordered the occupants to leave the car. Surprised and confused by these events, Sandino managed to persuade the patrol's commander, Major Delgadillo, to carry a message to Somoza asking for a chance to talk with him. Delgadillo phoned the request to Somoza, who also almost weakened at the last moment, especially since Sandino appealed to the fact that they both were Masons, and Abunza had to take the phone away from the Jeffy director and order the major to proceed with the execution, quote unquote. Sandino's father and Salvatierra were then locked up, and Sandino, Umanzar, and Estrada were loaded onto a truck and driven to the airfield. There they were lined up and shot and buried in great secrecy under the airport runway. These three were not the only ones to die that night. Socrates Sandino, Augusto's brother, along with General Santos Lopez, had stayed with Salvatierra's son-in-law, Roland Murillo, in Salvatierra's house. A Guardia patrol was sent to capture them, but they resisted. In the ensuing fight, Socrates was killed and Murillo mortally wounded, but General Lopez managed to escape. Somoza may possibly have claimed to have had Lane support for these actions, but it is clear that Lane did not approve. He heard the shots from Salvatierra's house and tried to phone Somoza, but discovered that his phone had been cut, an action that convinced him that something very serious was happening. On his way to the legation phone, he passed Salvatierra's home and saw a wounded man on the pavement and a large group of the Guardia armed with machine guns and rifles. A captain told him that the occupants of the house had fired at the Guardia and that the fire had been returned. Lane continued on the legation and phoned the president, who urgently requested him to come to the palace. On the way there, Lane passed Somoza's quarters, which he announced were heavily protected with sandbags and machine gun emplacements. The Sacasa family was extremely upset. The president's daughter had witnessed part of the arrest and informed her father, who then discovered that all the communication with the Guardia had been cut. He asked Lane to go to Somoza's headquarters and bring the general to him, a request that the minister promptly granted. The Guardia's erstwhile leader was anything but the picture of a swaggering, satisfied general who engineered a major coup. Somoza was afraid to go to the presidential palace for fear somebody would take vengeance, and it was only by offering to personally accompany him that Lane was able to persuade him to go. There, Somoza professed ignorance of Sandino's fate, but acknowledged that Salvatore and Sandino's father were in prison. The Jeffrey director claimed that he could not guarantee their lives as far as the Guardia was concerned, and both he and Sacasa asked Lane to take the prisoners to the American legation. Lane did this, and later, under the protection of legation's guard, delivered them to the presidential palace. Orders had also been issued for Guardia to concentrate around Sandino's camp and Wiwili and forcibly disarm his troops and to arrest several leading conservatives. The president blocked the latter action, but could only postpone the former, which specified that if Sandino's men did not give up their arms, they were to be exterminated. This order was carried out ruthlessly. The Guardia claimed that only 22 men were killed in the attack, but other accounts placed the total at over 300 and accused the Guardia of slaughtering women and children. The Guardia even tried to secure the services of an American aviator to bomb the Sandinistas, a move the State Department managed to block. Some of Sandino's followers, notably Pedro Alarmano, escaped and resumed the guerrilla warfare. Without Sandino, however, the illiterate Padron could do little more than annoy the Guardia. For the moment, at least, Sandinismo had been eliminated, a major political force in Nicaragua. The murder of Sandino has traditionally been viewed as a deliberate act of Somoza's design to clear the path to power. An analysis of Somoza's actions before and after the killings, however, supports the thesis that Somoza was pressured by his own subordinates into taking this action. Somoza had repeatedly warned Bliss Lane about the Guardia's attitude, had declared he could not control the force, and had begged to be allowed to imprison Sandino. 2 days after the assassination, he apologized to Lane, stating that he could not keep his promise because feeling among the Guardia officers was strong about Sandino, though he admitted that those who seized and shot Sandino acted under orders. These statements are not necessarily contradictory. Somoza did issue orders to kill Sandino, but he did not in response to growing pressure from other officers. He did not. He did so in response. While he remained alive, Sandino was a threat to the position of virtually every officer in the Guardia. Sandino had openly denounced the Guardia, had fought it in the Segovias for years, and declared his independence of it, and even offered to protect the president against it. Sandino saw in the Guardia of his time an embryonic monster that could one day betray Nicaragua. He had been prepared to retain his arms in defiance of the Guardia orders, and finally, one of his advisors had been appointed presidential delegate with possible command over Guardia units in the northern area of Nicaragua, an act Somoza described as an intolerable insult. The continued presence of such a man in Nicaragua threatened the position of the degraded status of every officer. The officers who acted against Sandino did so for their own interests, not Somoza's, and they might well have done so even if the general had not concurred. Somoza would probably have preferred to arrest and perhaps exile Sandino, but opposition from Sacasa and Bliss Lane made this virtually impossible, left with the alternative of either killing Sandino, allowing him to leave Managua with his position greatly enhanced by Sacasa's concessions. Somoza ordered his death. He did so with considerable trepidation, fearing that the action might well lead to his own downfall, and Sandino's ghost has haunted the Somozas ever since. Somoza did covet the presidency, and 2 years later would oust Sacasa. But in the days following the murder, when rumors of such action were rampant, he almost crawled before the president to prove his loyalty. The fear that Lane observed in Somoza after Sandino's death is a natural reaction from a man who had been pressured into ordering a course of action he would rather have postponed or settled in some other manner. Shortly after the killings, General Somoza, under great pressure from Somoza to punish those responsible, called in several officers and told them that while he realized the whole Guardia was responsible, somebody must assume guilt. Such a statement makes little sense if Somoza alone initiated the plot, but it is quite natural if the other officers had urged and supported this action. The days following Sandino's death produced a host of rumors that Somoza, supported by the United States, would shortly attempt to replace Sacasa. The American minister strove to halt such reports and to get State Department authorization to issue a statement that the United States would not recognize any regime that took power by revolutionary means, but the department would only permit him to make such statements orally to Somoza. Lane's fight to issue a public statement culminated in February 24th conversation with Ed Wilson in the department's Latin American division. Wilson repeated that the department's opinion that talking privately to Somoza might serve to stabilize things and prevent a revolutionary movement. Lane was sure that this was inadequate, telling Wilson he had already spoken to Somoza and could see no value in repeating himself, adding that the opinion seems to prevail that the United States is supporting Somoza in an attempt to bring about a coup. According to Lane, the situation in Nicaragua bordered on anarchy, with two armed governments coexisting in Managua. One was on La Loma, where the president had turned his residence into an armed camp with trenches and machine guns. The other consisted of Somoza and his men, only a few hundred yards away. Unless something was done, Lane felt a clash was inevitable, stating flatly that American inaction was inviting a military dictatorship, and if the department still refused to act, he would absolutely assume no responsibility for what may happen. In the short run, Lane's fears proved exaggerated, for the expected coup simply failed to materialize. Somoza at first went to almost every length to appease Sacasa, even offering up Captain Policarpo Gutierrez, the one-armed officer Lane had seen in Salvatori's house, as a scapegoat for the entire affair. As it turned out, no Guardia officer was ever punished for participating in Sandino's murder, but this was not known in February. The murders of Estrada and Manzor and Murillo and the campesinos at Willy likewise went unpunished. On February 25th, the president and the Jeffy director issued statements on Sandino's death. Sacasa stated that the killings were done by a group of officers acting in direct violation of his orders. He denounced their actions as an unjustifiable crime due to the defective functioning of the Guardia and promised to expose and punish those responsible. Somoza attempted to accept these attacks on the Guardia without complaint. In his announcement, he described the killings as a deplorable event, promised to discover those responsible, and publicly pledged his loyalty to that of the Guardia and to President Sacasa. Still fearing a military coup, the president continued to protect La Loma with troops drawn from outside the Guardia and to demand copies of the Guardia codes so that his staff could decode all messages. He even called General Somoza and several of his officers up to Presidential Palace, where he made them repeat the oaths of loyalty in the presence of the diplomatic corps. This angered Lane, who, along with other diplomats, had not been informed of what was to transpire. Such action, he felt, was designed to humiliate Somoza, and he resented being made a party to it. Earlier in March, crisis began to ease. Somoza grudgingly agreed to the president's plan to issue decrees establishing a basic law for the Guardia and reforming it to make it conform to the Constitution. In an executive decree, Sacasa provided the presidential control over the Guardia, giving him the right to issue direct orders directly to any officer to control the stationing and movement of the troops, to nominate, promote, and demote officers, and to approve all extraordinary expenses of the Guardia, to place Guardia police under Minister of Gobernacion, and to receive a daily report on the Guardia activities from the Jeffy director. The following issuance of the decree, Sacasa replaced several officers involved in the killings. Among these were General Abunza, the chief of staff, and Major Alfonso Gonzalez Cervantes, the Guardia paymaster. Abunza had originally been put into the Guardia to spy on Somoza, but had evidently switched loyalties. He and Somoza had even gotten drunk together, then staggered up to La Loma and called upon Sacasa to protest the continued presence of General Castro Wasmer, Somoza's personal enemy, as commander of the forces guarding the president. Sacasa sent Castro Wasmer back to Leon, but also decided to dump a bunza. Major Gonzalez Cervantes was ordered out at the same time, allegedly for mishandling funds and spending too much money on fiestas. Somoza tried to block Abunza's removal, though he felt he talked too much and was of little use to the Guardia, but Sacasa insisted he could not even allow Somoza to assign him to other duties. He would not. In picking replacements for these officers and making new appointments, the president demonstrated clear preference for his own relatives. And in Tokyo, Sacasa, the president's brother, became chief of staff of the Guardia, and Ramon Sacasa, the chief's executive cousin, and given command of the newly created Western Air with headquarters in Lyon. These actions seem to indicate that Sacasa had gained control over Somoza and the Guardia, ending the possibility of their moving against him. Such indications were soon to prove total illusory. Okay, so that's it. That's chapter changing command. This is Somoza takes charge. So we can see, it's basically simple. We see the U.S. government, the U.S. government, it's, white rapists, murderous butchers, they are, just, gun violent. They're violent, predators of third world peoples. They are predators of third world peoples across the world. They're violent predators of third world peoples. Somoza was in power. Sandino, made much trust in this deliberation. This is a trust thing. When a leader of a guerrilla faction comes, it is a trust thing. It is not to be decided with machine guns, but the U.S. government, they're violent white supremacist rapists and murderous butchers. So they decide everything with a pistol. They gave the machine guns to Nicaragua. The Nicaraguans just emulated the American approach to resolving dispute, machine gun the opposition. And that's the way you deal with it. The same thing that America does, the same thing Nicaragua does. It's the same exact thing. It is a violent society that the U.S. imposed in Nicaragua. They created a violent society, planted the seeds for a vicious campaign of terror by Somoza. Now, we went through all of the different things. Whether or not Somoza, Richard Millett discusses whether or not Somoza was actually, to be blamed. His actions in the future, describe someone that needed to be blamed for this incident. I don't see how you can, assess that one who gives the order to assassinate and murder, a person, a guerrilla leader in cold blood and execution style. He gave the order, he telephoned, he gave the order. How do you say that that is something that, is not really his decision? That's not appropriate. That's not appropriate. This is a mass murder. This is a brutal butcher of Nicaragua. He is a racist, butcher of Nicaragua. He catered to American English, and he didn't like Spanish as a language. And he kept the Nicaraguan people in a state of suffering for 30 years, from 1933 to 1959, 26 years, he kept Nicaragua in a state of, military affairs and murder. So this is not something that I would agree with. The suggestion that Somoza was not responsible, it's something that you could say that, he thought about it. But frankly, who gave the order was General Somoza. General Somoza gave the order. Who is responsible for the National Guard's action? It's General Somoza. So what is ultimately to be said? General Somoza should be hanged for this action. He should be hanged, or he should be, shot by a firing squad. That's what ultimately Sacasa should have done. But in essence, in this kind of situation, you have not a democracy. This is not a democracy. This is kind of a machine gun republic of the United States. So it's the standard thing. The rapists and white supremacists, murderous butchers of the U.S. government inflicted their, murder approach to Sandino. Okay, next is, Lane. So Lane did not actually order the assassination. He was stated to be against it. Nonetheless, the U.S. policies in Nicaragua set the stage for a campaign of murder, a machine gun resolution to disputes. The Americans give the machine guns to the South American people, to the Hispanic people, and then say, go to it, govern yourselves. That's the way America worked. And is that the appropriate thing? Introducing this sort of genocidal technology against against people is the American approach. It's like Yankees. It's like the Yankees, the New York Yankees. Machine guns and the New York Yankees go part and parcel with the American culture. And that is why Latin America is a complete failure from the perspective of the world. The American approach to Latin America is a failure because like the Yankees, the New York Yankees, the Americans used machine guns to, give and govern the people. And that is not the way you govern. You govern through diplomacy. You govern with tact and discussions. The U.S. government is, illiterate. They are illiterate white thugs, mafia thugs of white supremacy. And so they don't govern with, anything other than machine guns. At the butt of a pistol, you dissent. You get in prison. You get thrown in jail. Or you get machine gunned down. No matter what, it's subordination through pistols, through machine guns, through weapons. The American government is a racist state of rapists and white supremacists, murderous butchers, and they use machine guns to, enact their, campaign. Diplomacy does not exist in the American eye. They are not diplomats. They are not tactful logicians. They're not people who discuss things. They are people that resolve dispute strictly at the butt of a machine gun and a pistol. Look at their action in Venezuela. It is the same thing. They did a pistol discussion. They, pointed a pistol at Maduro and took him out and took over the oil supply of Venezuela. Look what they did in Iran. They, at the butt of a pistol, they said, you got to get out, and murdered Khomeini. And they, tried to take over the government. The standard thing, the racist whites of Washington, it's a mafia of white supremacist thugs. They have no business being in Latin America. Just as we said over and over again, they have no business being in colonialism anywhere in the world. They are not to be involved in any third world country. They are too dangerous. They are too violent. They are too dangerous, they are too violent, and they are too thug-like. They are too mafia, white supremacist-like to belong any colonialist regime anywhere in the world. They should be out of Iran. They should be out of Venezuela. They should be out of Latin America, and they should be out of Asia. Their actions all over the world indicate a group of dangerous, violent white supremacists that don't deserve to be in any way involved with government formation and politics. They are strictly to be involved with the United States of America. Only the boundaries of the U.S. 50 states is where U.S. belongs. Everywhere else, they are violent thugs, and they should be discounted, removed, and inability to accept the lands and the people's needs. That is what we say from this thing. So basically, Sandino was murdered. Sacasa was in power. Somoza is ready to take power against Sacasa and, to overthrow the democratically elected government of Nicaragua. This is to be discussed later. So again, the Google Drive link is in the description section. Please download the book. Basically, we are, discussing. We discussed they are not respected by the Hispanic people. The U.S. government are not respected by the Hispanic people and are violent in their treatment of the natives and poor in their economic system. They resolve things with machine gun justice. They were Nicaraguan rapists and murderous butchers in Nicaragua. Starvation of the people was rampant. Prostitution, however it was originated, it was present. The locals loved Sandino. They loved and he was loved by the Mexicans and Latin Americans. He was hated, but he was hated by the Americans. But that didn't matter. The racist butchers are not respected and resolve disputes and concerns only through machine gun fire. That is their violent predator, of third world peoples. They're violent predators of the third world. Continuing on, they forced the creation of the National Guard, an example of an American fascist white supremacist butchery against the Hispanic people. They forced the Guard, and that was run by pro-American, English-speaking, rapists and murderous Somoza, similar to the American government rapists and murderous white supremacists. Major Carter Constabulary, we describe the initial formation of the Guard. You can read it on your own. It's a good chapter. In the Guardia Reborn, we discussed the American destabilization campaign against Nicaragua with the creation of the National Guard by Stimson and Roosevelt, which was an example of meddling by U.S. government in Nicaraguan politics. The rapist pimps and murderous butchers of America have no right to meddle in Latin America because they are violent white supremacists with murder and rape as their specialty mode of ruling in Hispanic lands. They not only do not keep documentation of their murderous butchery in Latin America, nor do they acknowledge the rapes and murders of their troops or their paid assassins in power. The Nicaraguan Guard was created by the United States for the purpose of controlling the Nicaraguan people. It was meant to suppress dissent of the people and to ensure the death of Sandino. It failed on both points miserably while America was there, as America always fails miserably in its colonial actions. In Chasing Sandino, we discussed the rapists and murderous white butchers in their failed attempt to capture Sandino, the son of an Indian woman and Hispanic landowner in Nicaragua. Mexico was a good friend of Sandino, and the U.S. white mafia did not accept Sandino as a popular figure in Hispanic politics. He was a native and wanted in Latin American countries to decide Nicaraguan fate rather than the United States. He wanted an American withdrawal and acceptance by the United States that Latin America is sovereign and better suited for the governance in Hispanic countries. The rapist whites of Washington could not accept this and preferred Somoza, the English-speaking murderous, butcher, and rapist, as leader of the land. They hence trained the National Guard, and Stimson became good friends with Somoza. Just a few points on Sandino. Sandino was a very popular leader who was liked by the people and was able to mobilize popular resistance to American imperialism and murderous white supremacist anti-Hispanic butchery. Sandino was half Indian and was born in 1898 by an Indian woman and a Hispanic landowner. He was very respected in Latin America, unlike the white supremacists, rapists, and murderous butchers of the American government. So that's it. Again, Guardians of the Dynasty, the U.S. created National Guard, and the Somoza family, a history. We're going to continue tomorrow with the next 2 to 3 chapters. Thank you very much for joining. Krishna Iyer with the Iyer Think Tank in Delray Beach. Have a great day.